Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The thing about working patrol in rural New York is that isolation becomes your worst enemy long before any criminal does. I've been with the state police for 8 years now. Spent the last 3 working the back roads and forgotten corners of Sullivan County, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Meth labs and abandoned hunting cabins, domestic violence calls that turned into manhunts through miles of dense forest, missing persons cases where we'd find what was left of them months later, picked clean by the wildlife. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what we started calling the isolation protocol. It began on a Tuesday morning in late October 2023. The leaves were at peak color, drawing city tourists up from the 5 boroughs to take pictures and spend money in our little mountain towns. Route 17 was busier than usual, which meant more fender benders, more speeders, more routine traffic stops. I was working the day shift, covering the stretch of a highway between Liberty and Monticello, when the first call came through my radio. Unit 47, respond to 1847 Beaver Brook Road, Forestburg. Welfare check requested by family member. Subject failed to show for family dinner last night, not answering phone. Standard stuff. We get these calls all the time up here. Elderly folks living alone in houses that are miles from their nearest neighbor. Family members who worry when they don't hear back within 24 hours. Most of the time, it's nothing. Dead phone, power outage, or they just forgot about the dinner plans. But protocol is protocol. So I acknowledged the call and started the 30-minute drive through winding mountain roads. The thing about Sullivan County is that it's deceptively large. What looks like a short drive on the map can take you an hour when you're dealing with narrow roads that wind through mountains, single-lane bridges that date back to the 1940s, and stretches where your GPS just gives up and displays a message that might as well read, "You're on your own, buddy." The county covers over 900 square miles, but we've only got 12 troopers covering the whole area on any given shift. Sometimes less when people call in sick or get pulled for special assignments. That Tuesday, I was working alone. My usual partner, Tommy Rodriguez, was in court testifying on a drug case that had been dragging on for months. The next nearest unit was 40 minutes away, covering the eastern part of the county near the Pennsylvania border. Dispatch knew I was solo, but welfare checks are low priority. You don't usually need backup to tell an old lady that her daughter is worried about her. Beaver Brook Road isn't really a road. It's more like a suggestion. A narrow strip of cracked asphalt that winds through thick stands of maple and birch. Past houses that sit so far back in the trees you can barely see them from the road. Some of these properties haven't been properly surveyed since the 1800s, which means the address numbers are more like rough estimates. You might be looking for number 1847, but you'll pass houses numbered 1834, then 1851, then 1840, like someone just made up the numbers as they went along. The GPS in my patrol car lost signal twice during the drive, and I had to rely on the old paper maps we keep in the glove compartment. These maps are photocopies of photocopies, updated by hand whenever someone discovers a new road or an old one gets washed out by flooding. Half the roads on the map don't exist anymore, and half the roads that do exist aren't on the map. It's like navigating through a maze designed by someone with a grudge against postal workers. I'd been driving for about 25 minutes when I started seeing the signs that I was getting close to real isolation. The houses became fewer and farther between, then disappeared entirely. The asphalt gave way to gravel, then to dirt. The cell phone tower icons on my radio display went from 4 bars to 2 to none. This is the part of rural police work that city cops don't understand. You're not just alone, you're completely cut off from the world. If something goes wrong out here, you're on your own until you can drive back to civilization. The address led me to a mailbox that was so rusted I could barely make out the numbers. A dirt driveway disappeared into the trees, unmarked and uninviting. I radioed my location to dispatch, though I wasn't sure they could hear me through the static, and started the quarter-mile drive to the house. Unit 47, 1097 at 1847 Beaver Brook Road, I said into the radio. Investigating welfare check, will advise. The response came back fragmented. Opie that, 47, static, if you need, perfect. Even if I needed backup, dispatch might not be able to hear me call for it. The trees seemed to close in around my cruiser as I followed the rutted path. Massive oaks and maples formed a canopy so thick that even at 11, in the morning, it felt like dusk under there. My headlights automatically kicked on, cutting through the gloom, and that's when I saw it. A 2019 Honda Civic, silver, parked at an angle next to a small cabin. The driver's door was wide open. Now, there are a lot of innocent explanations for an open car door. Maybe she was unloading groceries and got distracted. Maybe she left it open to air out the car. Maybe the door doesn't close properly and she's been meaning to get it fixed. But when you're a cop, you learn to pay attention to the details that normal people might overlook. And something about the way the car was positioned, angled like it had been stopped in a hurry rather than carefully parked, set off alarm bells in my head. I pulled up behind the Honda and stepped out, immediately noting the silence. Up here in the mountains, you expect to hear birds, wind through the trees, maybe the distant sound of traffic from the highway, but there was nothing. Even my radio had gone completely quiet. No chatter from dispatch, no background static. Just an oppressive, unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. The cabin was small, maybe 800 square feet, with vinyl siding that had seen better days and a metal roof that was spotted with rust. It looked like it had been built in the 1970s as a hunting cabin or weekend retreat, then converted to a year-round residence by someone who didn't have much money to work with. A small front porch held a single rocking chair and a pile of unopened mail scattered across the wooden planks. The front door was closed, but even from a distance, I could see that the frame around the lock was splintered. That changed everything. This wasn't a welfare check anymore. This was a potential crime scene. "Mrs. Kowalski?" I called out, stepping carefully around the abandoned car. "This is New York State Police. Your daughter asked us to check on you." No response. I approached the Honda first, following basic crime scene protocol even though I didn't have backup. The keys were still in the ignition, which struck me as odd. Even in rural areas, people don't usually leave their keys in the car. The engine was cold, so it had been sitting there for a while. A purse sat open on the passenger seat, its contents scattered across the seat and floor. Wallet, makeup, receipts, pill bottles, all dumped out like someone had been searching for something specific. But the wallet was still there. Credit cards and driver's license visible. This wasn't a robbery. Robbers don't leave behind cash and credit cards. I keyed my radio, trying to raise dispatch. "Unit 47 to headquarters. I need a..." Nothing but static. My cell phone showed no bars. The isolation of this place was starting to work on me, creating that familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach that every rural cop knows. When you're 20 minutes from backup on a good day, and your communications are down, every call becomes potentially dangerous. I walked around the Honda, noting details. There were scratches on the driver's side door that looked fresh. The rear passenger window was partially rolled down, which seemed odd for October weather. Inside the car, I could see that the rearview mirror had been adjusted, tilted up toward the roof rather than positioned for driving. Someone had been using it to watch the road behind them. The splintered door frame told me this was no longer a simple welfare check. I drew my service weapon and approached the front door, following procedure as best I could without backup. The door was unlocked, or, more accurately, the lock had been forced. I could see tool marks on the metal deadbolt, and there were wood chips scattered on the porch where someone had used a crowbar or similar tool to break in. I pushed the door open with my foot and called out again. "Mrs. Kowalski, police!" The smell hit me immediately. Not the smell of death. I'd encountered that enough times to recognize it. But something else. Something chemical and sharp, like industrial cleaner mixed with something organic and rotten. It was the kind of smell that makes your eyes water and your throat close up. The kind of smell that tells you something very bad has happened here. I stepped inside, weapon ready, and immediately understood why the daughter had been worried. The interior of the cabin looked like a hurricane had torn through it. Furniture was overturned, books and papers scattered everywhere, family photos ripped from their frames and thrown across the floor. Drawers had been pulled out and dumped, cushions slashed open. Even the refrigerator had been moved away from the wall. But it wasn't random destruction. There was a pattern to it, a deliberate methodology that suggested this wasn't the work of desperate drug addicts looking for valuables to fence. Every mirror in the house had been shattered. Every single one. The bathroom mirror, a decorative mirror in the hallway, even a small compact mirror from the woman's purse. All broken, their fragments carefully arranged in small piles throughout the house. And on the wall, where the largest mirror had hung in the living room, someone had used what looked like black marker to write a single word: Watchers. That word sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. There's something deeply unsettling about finding a message like that in what should be someone's safe space, their home. It suggests a level of psychological disturbance that goes way beyond ordinary breaking and entering. I cleared the cabin room by room, following protocol as best I could while working alone. The kitchen had been torn apart, every cabinet opened, every drawer dumped. Canned goods were scattered across the floor, some of them dented like they'd been thrown against the walls. The stove had been pulled away from the wall, and I could see scratch marks on the floor where it had been dragged. The bathroom was even worse. The medicine cabinet had been ripped off the wall entirely, prescription bottles scattered in the sink and on the floor. The shower curtain had been torn down, and there were dark stains on the tiles that I didn't want to think too hard about. But what really got my attention was the bathtub. It was filled with murky brown water that looked like it had been sitting there for days, and floating on the surface were clumps of what looked like hair. But Mrs. Kowalski wasn't there. What I found instead in the bedroom made my blood run cold. The bed had been stripped, and the mattress had been cut open with something sharp. The stuffing had been pulled out and arranged on the floor in a perfect circle, about 6 feet in diameter. In the center of the circle was a pile of women's clothing, the outfit Mrs. Kowalski had presumably been wearing when she was taken. The clothes were torn and stained with something dark, but they hadn't been cut with any kind of blade. They looked like they'd been shredded by hands, human hands with fingernails, judging by the pattern of the tears. The sight of those shredded clothes in the middle of that circle of mattress stuffing was one of the most disturbing things I'd ever encountered in 8 years of police work. It suggested a level of ritualistic behavior that went far beyond a simple kidnapping or burglary. Someone had taken time to arrange this scene, to create this display, They wanted it to be found. Wanted whoever came looking to see exactly what they were capable of. But what really got to me was what I found pinned to the wall above the bed. Dozens of photographs, all showing the same thing. The cabin, taken from the woods around it, at different times and from different angles. Someone had been watching this place for weeks, maybe months. The photos were arranged chronologically, showing the progression of seasons from late summer into fall, documenting Mrs. Kowalski's daily routines with obsessive detail. In some of the photos, I could see Mrs. Kowalski through the windows, cooking dinner, watching television, talking on the phone. The photos were time-stamped, showing a pattern of surveillance that went back at least 2 months. Someone had been out there in the woods, watching her every move, learning her habits, planning whatever this was. But it wasn't just the cabin they'd been watching. Mixed in with the surveillance photos were pictures of other locations around the county. The grocery store where Mrs. Kowalski shopped, the post office where she picked up her mail, the small Methodist church where she attended services every Sunday, even the doctor's office where she went for her monthly checkups. This wasn't random. Someone had mapped out her entire life. The most recent photo made my hands shake. It showed Mrs. Kowalski's silver Honda pulling into the driveway, time-stamped at 6:47 p.m. the previous evening, just about 12 hours earlier. And in the background of the photo, barely visible among the trees, was the outline of a person watching from the woods. The photographer had captured the moment before the abduction, documented it like they were recording a hunting expedition. I tried my radio again, desperate to call this in as a kidnapping and get crime scene techs out here. But the static was getting worse. Whatever was interfering with communications seemed to be getting stronger. The smart thing would have been to drive back toward the highway immediately, get to a spot where I could call for backup and turn this over to detectives. That's when I heard the screaming. It came from somewhere deeper in the woods, distant but clear. A woman's voice, high and terrified, calling for help. The sound cut through the October air like a knife, unmistakably human and unmistakably in distress. Every instinct told me to wait for backup, to follow protocol, to not go into those woods alone. But the screaming was coming in regular intervals, like someone was being hurt repeatedly, and I couldn't just sit there and listen to it. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed into the trees, following the sound. The undergrowth was thick, full of thorns and fallen branches that caught at my uniform and made each step treacherous. This wasn't maintained forest. This was wilderness, the kind of deep woods where people get lost and never found. The canopy overhead was so thick that my flashlight beam seemed weak and ineffective, swallowed up by the darkness. The screaming continued, always seeming to come from just ahead, just out of sight. But there was something strange about it, something that my cop instincts were trying to tell me. The intervals were too regular, too consistent. Real screams of pain or terror don't come at measured intervals like that. They're unpredictable, chaotic. This sounded almost mechanical, like someone playing a recording on a loop. After about 10 minutes of fighting through the brush, I came to a small clearing. In the center of it was something that shouldn't have been there, an old root cellar, the kind that families used to build to store vegetables through the winter. But this one had been modified. The wooden door had been replaced with something that looked like steel, and there were fresh scratches in the dirt around the entrance, as if someone had been dragged there. The screaming was coming from inside, but now that I was closer, I could tell it wasn't right. It was too clear, too consistent. Someone was playing a recording through speakers hidden in the root cellar. But why? What was the point of luring me out here with fake screams? I approached the cellar door carefully, weapon drawn, trying to figure out what I was walking into. That's when I noticed the other sounds, real sounds, coming from inside the cellar. Whimpering, crying. Someone was actually in there, someone real, someone who needed help. "Mrs. Kowalski?" I called out, staying well back from the door. "This is the police. Can you hear me?" The recorded screaming stopped abruptly, like someone had hit a switch. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the noise had been. Then I heard a voice, weak and hoarse, but definitely human. "Help me," the voice called out. "Please, someone help me." I tried the door and found it secured with a heavy padlock that looked new. The metal was scratched and dented, as if someone had tried to break it from the inside. But there was something else. A wire running from the lock into the ground, disappearing into the dirt like it was connected to something underground. "Ma'am, I'm going to get you out of there," I called through the door. "Just hold on." That's when I heard her voice, clearer now. "He's coming back. He said he's coming back tonight with the others. Don't let him take me again." Others? What others? I tried my radio one more time, but the static was so bad it was useless. I needed tools to break that lock, and I needed backup. But I also couldn't leave her there, not knowing when this maniac might return. And what had she meant by others? "Ma'am, my name is Officer Rivera," I called through the door. "Can you tell me your name?" "I'm Helen Kowalski. They took me from my house last night. There are others here, other women. He keeps us in different places." The implications of what she was telling me hit like a freight train. This wasn't a single kidnapping. This was part of something bigger, more organized. Someone was collecting women from isolated rural homes, storing them in underground prisons scattered throughout the county. "How many others?" I asked. "I don't know. 3, maybe 4. He moves us around so we can't help each other escape. Says it's more efficient this way." Efficient? Jesus Christ, this psychopath was treating kidnapping like a business operation. "Mrs. Kowalski, I'm going to get help," I told her. "I'll be back in 20 minutes with people and tools. Just hang on." "Don't leave me," she pleaded. "What if he comes back while you're gone?" It was an agonizing decision. Every minute I stayed here was a minute I couldn't call for backup. But every minute I was gone was a minute she'd be alone and terrified, wondering if her captor was coming back to move her again, or worse. I made the call that probably saved her life. I stayed. Instead of driving back for help, I started looking for another way into the root cellar. These old structures usually had ventilation shafts or secondary entrances, especially if they'd been modified for long-term storage. It took me 15 minutes of searching, but I found what I was looking for: a metal grate set into the ground about 20 feet from the main entrance, partially hidden under fallen leaves. The grate was secured with a smaller padlock, one I might be able to break with the tools in my patrol car. I ran back through the woods, gathered everything that might be useful: tire iron, emergency toolkit, even the jack handle, and returned to the grate. It took me another 10 minutes of careful work, but I managed to break the smaller lock without making too much noise. The grate opened onto a narrow shaft that dropped down into darkness. I could hear Mrs. Kowalski somewhere below, still talking to herself to stay calm. "Mrs. Kowalski, I'm coming down," I called softly. I found another way in. The shaft was barely wide enough for my shoulders, and I had to lower myself down using my flashlight to guide the way. The drop was about 8 feet into what had once been a root cellar but had been converted into something much more sinister. The space was larger than I'd expected, maybe 12 feet square, with concrete walls that looked like they'd been poured recently. This wasn't some abandoned structure. Someone had put time and money into making this place. There were electric lights wired into the ceiling, running off what looked like a car battery. A bucket in the corner served as a makeshift toilet. Blankets were piled in another corner, and I could see restraints, chains and handcuffs, attached to rings that had been bolted into the walls. Mrs. Kowalski was huddled in the far corner, and she looked like she'd been through hell. She was probably in her 60s, gray-haired and normally well-groomed. But now she was dirty and disheveled, wearing the same clothes she'd been kidnapped in. She had a chain around her ankle that was attached to the wall, giving her maybe 6 feet of movement in any direction. But what really struck me was her eyes. She wasn't broken. She was angry. Terrified, yes, but furious about what had been done to her. She was a fighter, and that had probably kept her alive. "Are you hurt?" I asked, checking her over quickly while I worked on the chain around her ankle. "Bruised, but nothing serious," she said. "He's been careful not to damage the merchandise." Merchandise. The way she said it made my skin crawl. "Mrs. Kowalski, I need you to tell me everything you can about who did this and where the other women might be." While I worked on her restraints with my emergency tools, she told me a story that still gives me nightmares. Her captor was someone who knew law enforcement procedures, someone who understood patrol patterns and response times. He'd been watching her for months, learning her routines, waiting for the perfect opportunity. He'd taken her during what he called the window, the time between the evening patrol and the overnight shift change, when response times in rural areas are at their longest. He knew exactly how long it would take for someone to find her missing, and how long it would take for police to respond to her isolated location. But the worst part was what he'd told her about his other victims. He'd been operating for at least a year, taking women from isolated rural homes across multiple counties. He had a network of underground holding facilities, moving his victims between them to prevent escape and avoid detection. And he wasn't working alone. He'd mentioned buyers and delivery schedules, like he was running some kind of human trafficking operation. I finally got the chain off her ankle and helped her to her feet. She was weak from being confined, but determined to get out of there. That's when we heard the sound that every cop dreads. Footsteps overhead and voices. He was back, and he wasn't alone. We froze, listening to the conversation happening above our heads. 2 male voices, maybe 3, discussing something in low tones. I could only catch fragments, but what I heard made my blood run cold. Police car at the house. Cleanup protocol. Move the others tonight. These weren't random criminals. They were organized, professional, and they had contingency plans for dealing with law enforcement. They'd found my patrol car at Mrs. Kowalski's cabin and come to the root cellar to move her before I could return with backup. I had maybe 2 minutes before they opened that steel door and found us gone. 2 minutes to get Mrs. Kowalski out of there and into the woods, where we might have a chance of evading them until help arrived. "Can you run?" I whispered. "I'll run like hell," she whispered back. I boosted her up through the ventilation shaft first, then hauled myself up after her. We were barely clear of the grate when we heard the main door open and angry voices as they discovered the empty cell. We ran. Through the dark woods, over fallen logs and through thorny underbrush, with the sound of pursuit behind us. Mrs. Kowalski was 63 years old and had been held captive for over a day, but she ran like an Olympic sprinter. Fear and adrenaline are powerful motivators. I was trying to lead us back toward my patrol car, but in the darkness and panic I'd lost my bearings. The woods all looked the same, and every direction seemed to lead deeper into wilderness. Behind us, I could hear flashlights and voices getting closer. That's when Mrs. Kowalski grabbed my arm and pointed to our left. "The old logging road," she gasped. "I used to hike these woods with my husband. There's a logging road that comes out near the main highway." We changed direction, crashing through the underbrush toward what I hoped was salvation. The logging road, when we found it, was barely more than 2 tire ruts through the forest. but it was a path that led somewhere other than deeper into the woods. We ran down that road for what felt like miles, but was probably only half a mile, until we saw the most beautiful sight in the world: the glow of headlights on the main highway. I'd never been so happy to see traffic in my life. We flagged down the first car we saw, a pickup truck driven by a local contractor who was heading home from a job site. He took one look at us, a disheveled state trooper and a traumatized elderly woman covered in dirt and scratches, and didn't ask any questions. He just told us to get in and started driving toward the nearest place with cell phone service. 20 minutes later, we were at the Liberty Barracks, and I was briefing every available officer in the county about what we'd discovered. The response was immediate and massive. Within 2 hours, we had FBI agents driving up from New York City, state police SWAT teams, K-9 units, and enough patrol officers to lock down every road in a 20-mile radius. But when we returned to the root cellar with a full tactical team, it was empty. Not just empty. It had been cleaned out completely. The restraints, the lights, the bucket, even the car battery that had powered the electrical system, all gone. The only evidence that anyone had ever been held there was the scratches on the concrete walls where Mrs. Kowalski had tried to claw her way out. The same story repeated itself at 2 other locations we found over the next few days. Underground holding cells that had been hastily abandoned, cleaned out so thoroughly that the crime scene techs could barely find enough evidence to prove anyone had been there. Whoever was running this operation had procedures for law enforcement contact, and they'd executed those procedures perfectly. What we did find, scattered around the areas where the cells had been located, told a chilling story. Credit cards and driver's licenses from 7 different women, spanning 3 counties and going back 18 months. Cell phones that had been smashed and scattered. Personal items, jewelry, photographs, prescription medications that painted a picture of victims who'd been selected carefully and taken with precision. The FBI brought in profilers who said we were dealing with an organization, not an individual. The level of planning, the sophisticated surveillance network, the multiple holding facilities, the contingency plans for law enforcement contact. This was human trafficking on a scale they'd rarely seen in rural areas. But most disturbing of all was the realization that whoever was running this operation understood law enforcement procedures intimately. They knew patrol schedules, response times, communication dead zones, even the protocols we followed for missing persons cases. They'd been using our own limitations against us, exploiting the isolation and limited resources that define rural police work. The investigation that followed consumed 6 months of my life and the lives of every other law enforcement officer in the region. We found evidence of at least 12 women who'd been taken from isolated rural homes across a 4-county area. Most of them were elderly, living alone, with limited family contact. The kind of people who might not be missed for days or weeks. We never found most of those women. What we did find, in a series of shallow graves in state forest land, were the remains of 3 victims who'd apparently been killed when they became too difficult to handle or transport. The autopsy reports are classified, but I can tell you that these women died hard. The case broke open 6 weeks after Mrs. Kowalski's rescue, and it broke in the most unexpected way possible. One of the FBI agents working the case got a call from a colleague in the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division. They'd been investigating a money laundering operation that moved cash through rural banks in upstate New York, and they'd found something interesting in the financial records. Regular cash deposits, always under the federal reporting limit, going into accounts owned by shell companies registered in Delaware. The deposits came from banks in small towns across the region, always in amounts that wouldn't trigger automatic reporting to federal authorities. But when they mapped the locations of these deposits against the locations where women had been taken, The pattern was obvious. Someone was being paid for these kidnappings, and they were laundering the money through a sophisticated network of fake businesses and rural banks. This wasn't just human trafficking. It was a business operation that had been running for years. Following the money led us to a network of people who'd been involved in the trafficking operation at different levels. Low-level associates who scouted potential victims and provided surveillance. Middle-level operatives who handled the actual kidnappings and maintained the holding facilities. And somewhere at the top, people who managed the business side of the operation and interfaced with the buyers. But we never caught the people at the top. By the time we started making arrests, the operation had been shut down, and the key players had disappeared. We got enough evidence to prosecute 12 people on various charges related to kidnapping, human trafficking, and money laundering. But the masterminds behind the operation vanished like smoke. The trials were a media circus that painted our entire region as a hotbed of human trafficking and police incompetence. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were just small-time criminals who'd been manipulated by mysterious figures they'd never actually met. Prosecutors countered that organized crime doesn't excuse individual participation in kidnapping and murder. In the end, most of the defendants took plea deals and got sentenced to between 10 and 25 years in federal prison. A few went to trial and got life sentences, but none of them could or would tell us who'd been running the operation. Mrs. Kowalski survived, physically at least. She testified at every trial, facing down the people who'd participated in her kidnapping with a courage that still amazes me. But the psychological trauma of being held captive for 36 hours, knowing that other women were being held in similar conditions, never really left her. She moved to Florida to live with her daughter 6 months after the trials ended, but I heard through the grapevine that she never really recovered from the experience. Can't say I blame her. As for me, I stayed with the state police for another 2 years before transferring to a different county. Not because I was forced to, but because I couldn't handle the isolation anymore. Every time I got a call to check on someone in a remote location, every time my radio went silent in a dead zone, every time I had to approach an abandoned building alone, I found myself wondering if there was another trafficking network out there. Another group of predators using the limitations of rural law enforcement against itself. The thing about the isolation protocol case is that it changed how I think about rural police work fundamentally. Before this happened, I thought the biggest dangers we faced were drunk drivers, domestic violence, and the occasional drug dealer who thought he could hide in the woods. Simple criminals doing simple crimes for simple reasons. But this case taught me that rural areas aren't immune to sophisticated organized crime. They're actually perfect for it. The isolation that makes these places peaceful and attractive to people who want to get away from urban problems also makes them ideal hunting grounds for predators who understand how to exploit that isolation. Think about it. If you wanted to kidnap someone and hold them captive, would you do it in Manhattan, where there are police everywhere and neighbors who might hear screams? Or would you do it in a place where the nearest neighbor is half a mile away, where police response times are measured in tens of minutes instead of seconds, and where communication systems are unreliable? The people who ran this trafficking operation understood rural law enforcement better than most rural cops understand it themselves. They knew our staffing levels, our patrol schedules, our communication dead zones. They knew which roads we traveled regularly and which areas we rarely checked. They knew how long it took us to respond to different types of calls in different parts of the county. Most importantly, they knew that rural cops work alone most of the time, with limited backup and communications. They'd turned our own isolation against us, using it as a weapon to hunt people who trusted us to protect them. That realization haunted me for months after the case officially closed. How many other rural areas were being targeted by similar operations? How many elderly people living in isolated houses were being watched right now by predators who understood exactly how vulnerable they were? How many police departments like ours were dealing with disappearances that they attributed to people wandering off into the woods or deciding to leave town without telling anyone? The FBI told us that human trafficking networks prefer rural areas, specifically because law enforcement there is understaffed and under-resourced. Urban police departments have the manpower and technology to mount massive investigations when people disappear. Rural departments like ours are lucky if we can spare 2 officers for a missing persons case, and we often have to wait days for crime scene techs or specialized investigators. But what really kept me awake at night was the knowledge that we'd probably only scratched the surface of this operation. We'd rescued 1 woman and found evidence of 12 victims, but the financial records suggested the network had been operating for years. How many women had been taken before we stumbled onto this case? How many had been sold to buyers we'd never identify? How many had been killed and buried in graves we'd never find? The answer, according to the FBI's final report, was probably dozens. The money laundering network had been moving hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, which suggested a scale of operation that went far beyond what we'd uncovered. Somewhere out there, in rural communities across multiple states, were families who'd never learned what happened to their missing relatives. 6 months after I transferred to Delaware County, I got a call from Mrs. Kowalski. She was living in Florida with her daughter, trying to rebuild her life, but she'd been following the news about similar cases in other states. The FBI had been finding evidence of trafficking networks that used the same methods, targeting elderly women in isolated rural homes, using sophisticated surveillance, exploiting the limitations of rural law enforcement. "Officer Rivera," she said, and I could hear the determination in her voice. "I want you to know that what happened to me wasn't your fault. You saved my life and you helped catch the people who did this. But I also want you to know that this isn't over. There are other networks out there, other women who need help." She was right. Over the next year, I read about cases in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and West Virginia that showed similar patterns. Elderly women disappearing from isolated rural homes. Evidence of sophisticated surveillance. Underground holding facilities that were hastily abandoned when law enforcement got too close. Money laundering networks that moved cash through rural banks. The isolation protocol wasn't just one case. It was a pattern of organized crime that had been operating across rural America for years, hidden in plain sight by the very isolation that made these communities attractive places to live. The more I learned about similar cases, the more I realized that we'd been fighting the wrong war. We'd been thinking about rural crime in terms of individual bad actors. The meth cook in the abandoned trailer. The domestic abuser who terrorizes his family. The drunk driver who kills someone on a back road. But the isolation protocol showed us that organized criminals had figured out how to use rural isolation as a strategic advantage. They weren't hiding from law enforcement. They were exploiting law enforcement's limitations. 2 years after the original case, I was working patrol in Delaware County when I got a call that brought all those memories flooding back. Another welfare check. Another elderly woman living alone. Another remote location where my radio wouldn't work properly. But this time, I knew what to look for. The call came in on a Thursday morning in November 2025. Mrs. Patricia Hennessy, age 71, hadn't shown up for her weekly bridge game the night before. Her friends had called her house repeatedly, but there was no answer. They'd driven by and seen her car in the driveway, but she hadn't answered the door. The caller, Mrs. Hennessy's bridge partner, said this was completely out of character. Patricia was obsessively punctual and never missed their weekly game. The address was on Hollow Road, about 20 miles south of Delhi, in an area I'd never patrolled before. According to the map, it was a dead-end road that wound through state forest land, with maybe half a dozen houses scattered along its length. The kind of place where people went to get away from everything, including, potentially, law enforcement oversight. This time, I didn't go alone. I called for backup before I even left the station, and I made sure dispatch knew exactly where I was going and when I expected to be back. I also brought equipment that we hadn't had during the Kowalski case, a portable radio repeater that could boost my signal, and a GPS tracker that would let headquarters know my exact location, even if I couldn't communicate verbally. The drive to Hollow Road took me through some of the most isolated country in Delaware County. Miles of state forest with no houses, no businesses, no signs of human habitation except for the occasional hunting cabin tucked back in the trees. The kind of landscape where you could disappear completely and never be found. My backup, Officer Janet Walsh, met me at the intersection of Hollow Road and State Route 28. Janet had been with the department for 15 years and had heard about the Kowalski case from other officers. She understood why I'd requested backup for what should have been a routine welfare check. "What's your gut telling you about this one?" she asked as we compared notes about the call. "My gut's been wrong before," I said. "But something about the timing bothers me. Why call the police instead of just driving over to check on her themselves? These bridge players have been friends for 20 years. They know where she keeps her spare key." We drove down Hollow Road together, Janet following about 100 yards behind my patrol car. The road wound through dense forest for about 3 miles before we started seeing houses, big, expensive-looking places set far back from the road, the kind of retreats that wealthy city people buy as weekend getaways. Mrs. Hennessy's house was the last one on the road, sitting at the end of a half-mile gravel driveway that disappeared into a grove of pine trees. A newish Toyota Camry was parked in front of a 2-story colonial that looked like it had been built in the last 10 years. Everything looked normal. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. But there was something wrong with the scene, something that took me a moment to identify. The house was too perfect. The lawn was immaculately maintained. The driveway was recently graded. Even the mailbox looked like it had been painted within the last month. But there were no personal touches, no garden decorations, no seasonal wreaths, no signs that an elderly woman actually lived there. Janet and I approached the house together, following the protocols we developed after the Kowalski case. One officer takes the front door, the other covers the back. Both officers maintain radio contact with dispatch at all times. No one enters the house alone. I knocked on the front door and called out, "Mrs. Hennessy, this is the Delaware County Sheriff's Office. Your friends asked us to check on you." No response. Janet radioed from the back of the house that all the windows were covered with heavy curtains and she couldn't see inside. The back door was locked, and there were no signs of disturbance. "Mrs. Hennessy, we're going to come inside to make sure you're okay," I called through the front door. "If you can hear me, please respond." Still nothing. I tried the door and found it unlocked, which immediately set off alarm bells. People who live alone in isolated areas don't leave their doors unlocked, especially elderly women who've lived through enough decades to understand how dangerous the world can be. Janet and I entered the house together, weapons drawn, clearing each room systematically. What we found inside made my skin crawl with recognition. The house was staged. That's the only way I can describe it. It looked like a model home that had been decorated by someone who'd never actually lived in a house. The furniture was expensive but impersonal. The kitchen was stocked with food, but it was all generic brands arranged in neat rows like a grocery store display. There were family photos on the mantelpiece, but they looked like stock photos that came with the frames. Most telling of all, there was no evidence that anyone had been living there recently. No dirty dishes in the sink, no personal items scattered around, no indentations in the furniture cushions. The bed was made with military precision, and the bathroom looked like it had been cleaned with a toothbrush. "This isn't right," Janet said, voicing what we were both thinking. "This isn't someone's home. This is a set." We found the real evidence in the basement, hidden behind a false wall that was almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. We discovered a sophisticated surveillance center. Multiple computer monitors showed feeds from hidden cameras scattered throughout the house and the surrounding woods. Professional-grade recording equipment was set up to capture audio and video from every room. And on a table in the center of the room was a collection of personal items that definitely didn't belong to Patricia Hennessy. Driver's licenses from 4 different women, all elderly, all from isolated rural addresses in different counties. Credit cards, cell phones, prescription medications, and jewelry that looked like it had been taken from victims rather than purchased. Most disturbing of all was a detailed map of the region with dozens of houses marked with colored pins. Red pins for completed, yellow pins for in progress, and green pins for potential targets. Mrs. Hennessy's address had a yellow pin. Janet was on the radio immediately, calling for every available unit and requesting FBI assistance. This wasn't just a missing person case. We'd stumbled onto what looked like the command center for another trafficking operation, one that had been operating right under our noses. While Janet coordinated the response, I studied the map more carefully. The pattern was disturbingly familiar. All the marked houses were in rural areas, isolated from neighbors, with elderly residents who lived alone. The completed pins were scattered across 5 counties, representing what I assumed were successful kidnappings. The potential target pins showed dozens of other houses that matched the same profile. But what really caught my attention was a notation in the margin of the map. Isolation Protocol, Phase 2. Phase 2. That meant the original trafficking network hadn't been destroyed. It had evolved. They'd learned from their mistakes in Sullivan County and developed new methods, new procedures, new ways to exploit rural isolation. The basement surveillance center told the story of those new methods. Instead of conducting lengthy surveillance from the woods around target houses, they'd started using temporary safe houses like this one. They'd rent or buy houses near their intended targets, set up surveillance equipment, and create the appearance of normal residents while they planned their operations. The fake Mrs. Hennessy setup was brilliant in its simplicity. They'd created a fictional elderly woman, complete with a driver's license and credit cards, and established her as a resident of Hollow Road. The bridge game story was probably fabricated, a way to create a plausible reason for someone to request a welfare check, which would bring law enforcement to the house where they could be observed and studied. We'd been set up. Someone had been watching our response to this call, learning our procedures, timing our arrival, studying how we handled a potential missing person case in an isolated area. They were gathering intelligence for future operations. The realization that we'd walked into a trap made my hands shake as I continued examining the surveillance equipment. Hidden cameras throughout the house had been recording our every move since we'd arrived. Someone, somewhere, was watching us right now, documenting our methods and procedures for future reference. "Janet," I called out. "We need to get out of here, now." She looked up from her radio. "What's wrong?" "We're being recorded. This whole thing is a setup to study law enforcement response." We evacuated the house immediately and established a perimeter while we waited for the tactical teams and FBI agents to arrive. Within 2 hours, we had enough law enforcement personnel on scene to secure a city block, But by then it was too late to catch whoever had been running the surveillance operation. The house had been rigged with remote monitoring systems that allowed the operators to watch their surveillance feeds from anywhere with an internet connection. As soon as we'd discovered the basement room, they'd known their operation was blown. By the time the FBI's technical team traced the network connections, the remote monitoring systems had been shut down and wiped clean. But they'd left behind enough evidence to confirm our worst fears. This wasn't just a continuation of the Sullivan County trafficking network. It was an expansion. The documents we found suggested they were operating in at least 8 counties across 3 states, using the same methods that had proven so effective in rural areas. The fake identification documents were sophisticated enough to fool casual inspection, which meant they could establish temporary residence in target areas without arousing suspicion. The surveillance equipment was military-grade, probably purchased through shell companies or stolen from government suppliers. And the operational planning documents showed a level of tactical sophistication that suggested involvement by people with military or law enforcement training. Most disturbing of all was what we found on the computers before the FBI technical team could fully analyze them. Partial records of what appeared to be an auction system, where potential buyers could bid on specific types of victims: age, physical characteristics, health status, family situation, all documented in clinical detail like they were selling livestock. The investigation that followed was even more extensive than the original Sullivan County case. Federal agencies got involved from multiple departments: FBI, Homeland Security, DEA, ATF, even the IRS Financial Crimes Division. The scope of the trafficking network was far larger than anyone had imagined. But once again, the masterminds behind the operation stayed one step ahead of law enforcement. By the time we started making arrests, the key players had disappeared, and the organizational structure had been dismantled. We caught some of the lower-level operatives, but the people running the business had vanished like ghosts. The trials that followed revealed the true scope of what we'd been dealing with. The network had been responsible for the disappearances of at least 30 women across multiple states over a 3-year period. They'd been using rural areas not just as hunting grounds, but as bases of operation, exploiting the limited law enforcement resources and slow communication systems that characterize rural policing. What made this network so effective was their understanding of rural psychology. They knew that people who chose to live in isolated areas valued their privacy and independence. They were less likely to report suspicious activity, less likely to call police for minor concerns, less likely to maintain close contact with neighbors who might notice when something was wrong. The network had weaponized rural values against rural communities. Mrs. Patricia Hennessy, as it turned out, had never existed. The identity was completely fabricated, created using stolen Social Security numbers and forged documents. The real owner of the house on Hollow Road was a shell company registered in Delaware, which was owned by another shell company registered in Nevada, which led to a maze of corporate entities that ultimately traced back to offshore accounts that had been closed and emptied by the time investigators found them. The bridge game story was fiction. The woman who'd called to request the welfare check had used a burner phone and given a fake name. She was probably one of the network's spotters, whose job was to create plausible reasons for law enforcement to visit surveillance houses so their response procedures could be studied and documented. It was a level of sophistication that would have been impressive if it hadn't been used for such evil purposes. The aftermath of the Hollow Road case changed my perspective on rural policing permanently. I'd always thought of myself as a small-town cop dealing with small-town problems, but these cases taught me that rural areas are connected to criminal networks that span multiple states and countries. The isolation that defines rural life has become a strategic resource for organized criminals who understand how to exploit it. Today, I work as a training instructor for the New York State Police, teaching courses on rural law enforcement tactics and organized crime recognition. Part of my job is helping rural officers understand that they're not just dealing with local problems anymore. They're on the front lines of a war against sophisticated criminal networks that use rural isolation as a weapon. The isolation protocol cases taught us that rural policing needs to evolve to meet new threats. We've developed new procedures for welfare checks in isolated areas, new communication protocols that don't rely solely on radio systems, new partnerships with federal agencies that can provide resources and expertise that small rural departments can't afford. But most importantly, we've learned to recognize the signs that a criminal operation is more sophisticated than it initially appears. The too perfect crime scenes, the surveillance equipment that shouldn't be there, the patterns of disappearances that seem random but follow predictable methodologies. Mrs. Helen Kowalski still calls me every few months to check in and share information about similar cases she's read about in other states. She's become an unofficial advocate for missing persons cases involving elderly rural residents, working with families and law enforcement agencies to ensure that these crimes don't get overlooked or attributed to natural causes. She's also become something of an expert on recognizing the signs of trafficking operations. Her experience as a victim gave her insights that law enforcement training can't provide, and she's helped identify patterns in several other cases that might have been missed otherwise. Officer Rivera, she told me during our most recent conversation, I want you to remember something important. What happened to me wasn't just about one psychopath with a plan. It was about a system, a business that treated human beings like products to be harvested and sold. And that business model is still out there, still operating, still evolving. She's right. The latest intelligence from federal agencies suggests that human trafficking networks have continued to evolve their methods, using advancing technology and increasingly sophisticated understanding of rural law enforcement limitations to stay ahead of investigators. They've learned from their failures in Sullivan County and Delaware County. They've developed new ways to conduct surveillance, new methods for establishing temporary bases of operation, new techniques for avoiding detection by law enforcement. Most importantly, they've learned to operate across wider geographic areas, making it harder for local and state agencies to recognize patterns and coordinate responses. The isolation that once protected rural communities from urban crime has become the very thing that makes them vulnerable to new forms of organized criminal activity. And the police officers who work these areas, officers like me, like Janet Walsh, like hundreds of others across rural America, are often the only thing standing between potential victims and predators who've turned rural geography into a hunting ground. Every time I respond to a welfare check now, every time I drive down a back road to investigate a suspicious activity report, every time my radio goes silent in a communication dead zone, I remember the lessons of the isolation protocol. I remember that isolation can be a weapon, that sophisticated criminals understand rural law enforcement better than we understand ourselves, and that the peaceful countryside can hide horrors that would be impossible in more populated areas. But I also remember Mrs. Kowalski's courage, her determination to fight back against people who tried to reduce her to merchandise. I remember that rural communities, when they understand the threats they face, can be incredibly resilient and protective of their own. And I remember that every small-town cop who learns to recognize these patterns, every rural community that develops better communication and support networks, every family that takes appropriate precautions without giving up their rural lifestyle, makes it a little bit harder for predators to operate. The isolation protocol was never just about one trafficking network or one series of kidnappings. It was about the vulnerability that comes with choosing to live apart from the crowd, and the responsibility that law enforcement has to protect people who've made that choice. It was about understanding that isolation can be both a blessing and a curse, depending on who's exploiting it and why. Most of all, it was about learning that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs and dramatic crimes. Sometimes it hides behind routine welfare checks and friendly neighbors and perfectly maintained houses in beautiful rural settings. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who understand exactly how the system works and how to use that understanding against the people the system is supposed to protect. The isolation protocol continues. New cases, new patterns, new methods, but the same fundamental vulnerability that comes with being alone in beautiful, dangerous places where help is always too far away, and communications don't always work, and backup might be an hour away on a good day. Rural law enforcement officers across the country carry the weight of protecting people who've chosen isolation, knowing that choice makes them both safer from urban problems and more vulnerable to predators who've learned to exploit rural advantages. We do it because someone has to. Because Mrs. Kowalski and people like her deserve to live safely in the places they've chosen to call home. Because the alternative, allowing organized criminals to turn rural America into a hunting preserve, is unacceptable. The isolation protocol is real, it's ongoing, and it's the responsibility of every rural law enforcement officer to understand it, recognize it, and do everything possible to protect the people who depend on us to keep the darkness at bay. Even when that darkness comes wearing a badge and carrying institutional knowledge and understanding our procedures better than we understand them ourselves, especially then. But the story doesn't end with training courses and new procedures. 3 months ago, I got a call that brought the isolation protocol full circle in a way I never could have predicted. I was at the academy teaching a class on rural crime scene management when my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a Delaware County number I didn't recognize, but something about the urgency of the ringtone made me step out of the classroom to answer it. Officer Rivera, this is dispatch in Delhi. We've got a situation that command thinks you need to know about. The voice belonged to Sarah Chen, a dispatcher I'd worked with for years before transferring to the academy. Sarah didn't call unless something was seriously wrong. What's going on, Sarah? We've got a missing person case that's showing some of the patterns you've been training us to watch for. Elderly woman, isolated rural location, family members who say the disappearance is completely out of character. But there's something else, something that makes command think this might be connected to your old cases. She paused, and I could hear the stress in her voice. The missing woman is Mrs. Eleanor Hartley. She's the widow of Sergeant Mike Hartley. The name hit me like a physical blow. Mike Hartley, the corrupt state police sergeant who'd been running the trafficking operation in Sullivan County, the man I'd killed in that hunting lodge 3 years ago. I'd known he was married, but I'd never met his wife. After Mike's death and the revelation of his crimes, she'd apparently retreated from public life completely. Where was she living? I asked, already knowing the answer would be somewhere isolated, somewhere perfect for the kind of operation her husband had been running. Rural address outside Andes. House sits on about 40 acres, no neighbors within half a mile. Her daughter in Albany called yesterday when Mrs. Hartley didn't answer her weekly check-in call. Said her mother never misses that call, has been doing it every Sunday for 10 years. What makes command think this is connected to the protocol cases? Because Mrs. Hartley called the department 2 weeks ago, said she'd been getting strange phone calls, hang-ups mostly, but also calls where someone would just breathe into the phone. She also reported seeing vehicles driving slowly past her house, people taking pictures of her property. We sent a patrol unit out to check, but everything looked normal. My blood ran cold, This was exactly how the trafficking networks operated. Surveillance, intimidation, psychological pressure designed to isolate victims and make them doubt their own perceptions. Sarah, who's handling the case? Detective Morrison just caught it this morning. He's good, but he's only been with the department for 2 years. He doesn't have experience with this kind of thing. I'm on my way. The drive from the academy to Delaware County took me through familiar territory, but this time I was seeing it through different eyes. Every isolated house, every stretch of road without cell coverage, every area where backup would be 20 minutes away, all of it looked like potential hunting grounds for predators who understood how to exploit rural vulnerabilities. I met Detective Morrison at the Delhi barracks, and my first impression was that he was competent but overwhelmed. He'd done everything by the book. Interviewed the daughter, checked with neighbors, put out a BOLO alert for Mrs. Hartley and her vehicle. But I could see from his case file that he was treating this as a standard missing person case, not as a potential trafficking operation. Detective, I know you've got this handled, but I'd like to ride along when you check her house. I might be able to spot things that relate to the protocol cases. Morrison looked relieved rather than offended. Honestly, I'd appreciate the help. Command briefed me on your background, and this case has some weird elements I'm not sure how to interpret. The drive to Mrs. Hartley's house took us through some of the most isolated country in Delaware County. Her property was at the end of a 2-mile dirt road that wound through state forest land, the kind of location that was perfect for someone who wanted complete privacy, or perfect for someone who wanted to hold captives without worrying about screams being heard. The house itself was a surprise. Instead of the small cabin or rundown farmhouse I'd expected, Mrs. Hartley lived in a large, well-maintained colonial that probably cost more than most cops make in 5 years. The property was beautifully landscaped, with gardens and outbuildings that showed careful attention to detail. But there were signs that something was wrong. The front door was standing open, which immediately set off alarm bells. A 70-year-old woman living alone in an isolated area doesn't leave her front door open, especially not in November when the temperature is dropping into the 30s at night. Morrison and I approached the house carefully, following the protocols I'd helped develop after the original protocol cases. We could see Mrs. Hartley's car, a late-model Subaru Outback, parked in the driveway, but there was no sign of her. "Mrs. Hartley," I called out from the front porch. "This is the police. Your daughter asked us to check on you." No response. Morrison tried his radio and got nothing but static. Another familiar pattern. Someone was jamming communications in this area, just like they had during the original cases. We entered the house together, weapons drawn, clearing each room methodically. What we found inside told a story that was both familiar and terrifying. The house had been searched, but not by amateurs. Whoever had been here knew exactly what they were looking for and how to find it without leaving obvious signs of forced entry. Drawers had been opened and contents examined, but then carefully replaced. Furniture had been moved to check for hiding places, but then positioned to look undisturbed. But there were signs for those who knew how to read them. Dust patterns on surfaces showed where items had been moved and replaced. Picture frames were hanging slightly crooked, suggesting they'd been removed to check for hidden safes. Even the refrigerator had been pulled away from the wall and then pushed back, leaving barely visible scuff marks on the floor. They were looking for something specific, I told Morrison. This isn't a random burglary. Someone came here with a purpose. What that purpose was became clear when we found Mrs. Hartley's home office. Her computer was gone, but the thieves had left behind something more valuable than any electronic device. A handwritten journal that had been hidden behind a false back in one of the desk drawers. Mrs. Hartley had been documenting everything. For 3 years, since her husband's death and the revelation of his crimes, she'd been investigating the trafficking network he'd been part of. The journal contained detailed notes about bank accounts, property purchases, vehicle registrations, and communications that suggested the network hadn't been destroyed. It had just gone deeper underground. But most damning of all were the entries from the past 6 months. Mrs. Hartley had apparently been contacted by someone who claimed to have information about other victims of her husband's trafficking operation. Someone who wanted to meet with her to share evidence that could help identify the people who'd been running the network from behind the scenes. The journal entries showed that Mrs. Hartley had been cautious at first, suspicious that the contact might be another trap. But over time, the person had gained her trust by providing details about her husband's crimes that only someone with inside knowledge could have known. The final entry, dated 4 days before her disappearance, was chilling. He wants to meet tomorrow night at the old quarry on Beaverkill Road. Says he has photographs and documents that prove who really ran the operation Mike was part of. Says there are people in positions of authority who helped cover up the trafficking network, and that Mike was just a middle manager in something much larger. I know this could be dangerous, but I need to know the truth about what my husband was involved in. If something happens to me, I've hidden copies of all my research where the police will find them. Eleanor Hartley, November 15th, 2025. Morrison and I looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Mrs. Hartley hadn't just been kidnapped. She'd been lured into a trap by someone who'd spent months gaining her trust. Someone who knew about her husband's crimes in detail and had used that knowledge to manipulate her into a vulnerable position. "We need to check that quarry," Morrison said. "And we need backup," I replied. "Lots of backup." The Beaverkill quarry was about 10 miles from Mrs. Hartley's house, down a series of increasingly isolated roads that would have made the perfect location for an ambush. The quarry itself had been abandoned for decades, leaving behind a deep water-filled pit surrounded by steep rock walls and accessible only by a single narrow access road. We didn't go in alone. Morrison called for every available unit in the county, and I used my academy contacts to get FBI involvement from the start. By the time we approached the quarry, we had 12 officers, 2 FBI agents, and a tactical team that could handle anything short of a full-scale military assault. What we found at the quarry was both more and less than we'd expected. Mrs. Hartley's Subaru was there, parked at the edge of the access road about 50 yards from the quarry pit. The driver's door was open, and her purse was on the ground beside the car, its contents scattered like she'd been grabbed while trying to get something out of it. But Mrs. Hartley herself was nowhere to be found. What we did find, hidden in the woods around the quarry, was evidence of a sophisticated surveillance operation. Hidden cameras had been positioned to monitor the access road and the area around the quarry pit. Wireless transmitters had been set up to relay video feeds to a remote monitoring station. And buried under camouflaged tarps were supplies that suggested someone had been planning to use this location for an extended operation. The FBI technical team found something even more disturbing when they analyzed the surveillance equipment. The cameras had been recording for weeks, documenting every vehicle that had come to the quarry and every person who had visited the area. But most of the recorded footage showed law enforcement vehicles, patrol cars conducting area checks, detectives investigating other cases, even training exercises conducted by the tactical team. Someone had been studying our procedures, our response times, our methods of operation. They'd been preparing for a confrontation with law enforcement, gathering intelligence that would help them stay one step ahead of any investigation. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated Mrs. Hartley. We found her 3 days later, alive but traumatized, in a hunting cabin about 15 miles from the quarry. She'd managed to escape from her captors during a transfer between locations, making her way through miles of forest to reach a seasonal hunting camp where she'd hidden until searchers found her. Her story, when she was finally able to tell it, revealed the true scope of what we'd been dealing with for the past 3 years. The trafficking network hadn't been destroyed when we'd arrested Mike Hartley's associates in Sullivan County. It had restructured, going deeper underground and developing more sophisticated methods of operation. But more importantly, it had been run from the beginning by people with access to law enforcement intelligence. People who knew our procedures, our capabilities, and our limitations because they were part of the system themselves. Mrs. Hartley's investigation had gotten too close to the truth. Her research had identified financial connections between the trafficking network and legitimate businesses, political connections that went all the way to the state capitol, and law enforcement connections that included active and retired officers from multiple agencies. The people who'd kidnapped her weren't just trying to silence her. They were trying to retrieve the evidence she'd gathered and eliminate the threat she represented to a criminal organization that had infiltrated law enforcement at multiple levels. But Mrs. Hartley had been smarter than they'd given her credit for. She'd hidden copies of her research in multiple locations, including a safety deposit box that would be opened automatically if she failed to check in with her bank within a specified time period. When she disappeared, that failsafe was triggered, and federal investigators suddenly had access to 3 years' worth of evidence about corruption within rural law enforcement agencies. The investigation that followed was the largest law enforcement corruption case in New York state history. Over the course of 18 months, federal agents arrested 43 people on charges ranging from human trafficking to money laundering to conspiracy to commit murder. The defendants included police officers, sheriff's deputies, state troopers, county prosecutors, and even a federal judge who'd been providing inside information about trafficking investigations. The network had been more extensive and more deeply embedded in the system than anyone had imagined. They'd used their positions within law enforcement to identify potential victims, gather intelligence about investigations, and coordinate their operations across multiple jurisdictions. They'd been the wolves guarding the sheep, using their badges and their authority to hunt the very people they'd sworn to protect. Mike Hartley, it turned out, had been exactly what Mrs. Kowalski and I had thought he was: a middle manager in a much larger operation. His corruption and eventual death had barely disrupted the network's activities, because there were dozens of other corrupt officers ready to take his place. The trials that followed were a media circus that destroyed public trust in rural law enforcement across the entire region. Defense attorneys argued that their clients were victims of a vast federal conspiracy to destroy local autonomy. Prosecutors countered that corruption had become so endemic in rural police departments that federal intervention was the only way to protect the public. In the end, most of the defendants were convicted and sentenced to lengthy federal prison terms. Several plea bargains provided additional evidence that led to investigations in other states, revealing similar networks operating across rural America. But the damage to public trust took years to repair. Rural communities that had once relied on their local police departments found themselves wondering if the officers they'd trusted with their safety might actually be the greatest threat they faced. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley survived her ordeal and became a powerful advocate for law enforcement reform and human trafficking victims' rights. She used her husband's pension and life insurance money to establish a foundation that provides resources for rural communities trying to identify and prevent trafficking operations. She also testified before Congress about the vulnerabilities that rural isolation creates, both for potential victims and for the law enforcement agencies tasked with protecting them. Her testimony led to federal legislation that provides funding for improved communication systems in rural areas and mandatory training for rural officers on recognizing signs of organized criminal activity. What happened to me, she told the congressional committee, wasn't just about criminals who'd learned to exploit rural isolation. It was about a system that had become so isolated from oversight and accountability that corruption could flourish unchecked for years. We can't protect rural communities from organized crime if we can't trust the people wearing badges in those communities. As for me, the Hartley case marked the end of my involvement with the isolation protocol investigations. The academy promoted me to lead instructor for rural law enforcement training, and I've spent the past 2 years developing new curricula that address both the external threats rural officers face and the internal vulnerabilities that make corruption possible. Fact, it's a psychological condition that can affect both the communities we serve and the officers who serve them. When people are cut off from broader networks of support and accountability, they become vulnerable to manipulation and corruption in ways that might not be obvious until it's too late. The isolation protocol cases taught us that rural America faces threats that go far beyond anything we'd traditionally considered. Organized criminals have learned to exploit the very qualities that make rural life attractive: the privacy, the independence, the distance from urban problems, and turn them into weapons against the people who've chosen to live that way. But we've also learned that rural communities, when they understand the threats they face and work together to address them, can be incredibly resilient and effective at protecting themselves. The key is breaking down the isolation that makes these communities vulnerable in the first place. Today, the rural counties where the protocol cases occurred have some of the most sophisticated anti-trafficking programs in the country. They've developed communication networks that connect isolated residents with emergency services, training programs that help community members recognize signs of criminal activity, and partnership agreements that allow small rural departments to access federal resources when they're dealing with cases that exceed their capabilities. Mrs. Helen Kowalski, now in her 80s, serves on the advisory board of Mrs. Hartley's Foundation and continues to work with federal investigators on trafficking cases across the country. She's become something of a legend in law enforcement circles, the elderly woman who survived weeks of captivity and then dedicated the rest of her life to making sure no one else would have to endure what she experienced. Officer Rivera, she told me during our last conversation, the most important thing you can teach those young officers is that isolation is only dangerous when people don't understand how to use it properly. Rural communities chose isolation for good reasons: to build better lives, to raise families in safe environments, to maintain connections with the land and with each other that urban life doesn't allow. But isolation becomes dangerous when it's forced on people, when it's used to cut them off from help and support and community connections. The difference between chosen isolation and imposed isolation is the difference between safety and vulnerability. She's right, as she usually is. The isolation protocol wasn't really about geography or criminal methodology or even law enforcement procedures. It was about the difference between choosing to live apart from the crowd and being cut off from the help and community that everyone needs to stay safe. Rural law enforcement officers today carry the responsibility of protecting that difference, of ensuring that people who choose rural life can maintain their independence without sacrificing their security. It's a complex balance that requires understanding both the threats that rural communities face and the strengths they possess. The isolation protocol continues, but it's evolved from a criminal methodology into a law enforcement philosophy that recognizes both the vulnerabilities and the strengths of rural communities. It's about protecting chosen isolation while preventing imposed isolation, about maintaining the independence that makes rural life valuable while building the connections that make rural life safe. Every rural officer who understands these principles, every rural community that builds effective networks of communication and support, every federal agency that recognizes the unique challenges of rural law enforcement, All of them are part of the solution to a problem that goes far beyond any single case or investigation. The darkness is still out there, still looking for ways to exploit rural isolation and turn it into a weapon against the people who've chosen to live apart from urban crowds. But the light is there too, in the form of community connections, professional training, federal resources, and the hard-won wisdom of people like Mrs. Kowalski and Mrs. Hartley, who've faced that darkness and refused to be defeated by it. The isolation protocol is real, ongoing, and constantly evolving. But so is our understanding of how to counter it, how to protect the people who depend on us, and how to ensure that rural America remains a place where people can choose independence without sacrificing safety. The battle continues, the stakes remain high. And every day, in small towns and isolated communities across the country, rural law enforcement officers go to work knowing that they're the thin blue line between chosen isolation and imposed vulnerability. It's a responsibility that none of us take lightly, and it's a responsibility that defines what rural policing means in the 21st century. You want to know about corruption in small-town police departments? About how good cops get turned into something they never thought they'd become? About how money and power can rot a department from the inside out until there's nothing left but uniforms covering up monsters? Sit down. Turn off that recorder. What I'm about to tell you isn't going in any official report. Actually, you know what? Turn it back on. People need to hear this. People need to understand what really happens when a small town gets too comfortable with looking the other way. When local politics matter more than justice. When everybody's got secrets and nobody wants to be the one to start pulling threads. My name is Danny Kowalski. Yeah, same last name as the woman from that trafficking case upstate, but no relation. And I was a patrol officer with the Millbrook Police Department for 6 years. Millbrook's one of those picture-perfect Hudson Valley towns that looks like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Historic Main Street, antique shops, expensive restaurants that cater to weekend visitors from the city. Population about 1,500, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody and nothing bad is supposed to happen. Except something bad was happening. Had been happening for years. And by the time I figured out what it was, I was already in so deep I couldn't see daylight. Let me start at the beginning, because that's where the corruption started too, with something small, something that seemed harmless, something that everybody could rationalize as being for the greater good. I joined the Millbrook PD in January 2019, fresh out of the police academy and full of ideas about community policing and making a difference. The department was small, just 8 officers including the chief, but they had a good reputation in the county. Low crime rates, good relationships with the community, the kind of department that other towns envied. Chief Robert Harrison had been running the department for 12 years, and he'd built it into something special. He was one of those old-school cops who still believed in walking a beat, knowing everyone in town by name, solving problems before they became crimes. The kind of chief who'd rather help a drunk get home safely than arrest him for public intoxication. My first few months were everything I'd hoped police work would be. Minor traffic violations, noise complaints, the occasional domestic dispute that could be resolved with some careful talking. The most exciting call I responded to was a break-in at the antique shop that turned out to be the owner's cat setting off the motion detector. But there were things I noticed that didn't quite add up. Little things that by themselves didn't mean much, but together they painted a picture I wasn't smart enough to understand at the time. Like the way certain cars never got speeding tickets, no matter how fast they were going, or how many times officers saw them. Like the way certain names never appeared in our daily incident reports, even when I knew for a fact that we'd responded to calls involving those people. like the way Chief Harrison would sometimes pull case files from our system and take them home, returning them days later with instructions to reclassify incidents or change the details in our reports. I told myself it was just small-town politics. The chief knew these people personally, had grown up with them, wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt. That was part of what made small-town policing different from working in the city. Relationships mattered, context mattered. Sometimes a stern warning was more effective than formal charges. But looking back, I can see that I was being groomed. Chief Harrison was watching me, evaluating me, deciding whether I could be trusted with the truth about how the Millbrook Police Department really operated. The first test came in April, about 3 months after I'd started. I was working a night shift when I got a call about a disturbance at one of the big estates on the outskirts of town. These weren't ordinary houses. They were weekend retreats for wealthy New York City families, sprawling properties worth millions of dollars, the kind of places that generated most of the town's tax revenue. The call came from a neighbor who reported hearing screaming and what sounded like gunshots from the Morrison estate. The Morrisons were a banking family from Manhattan who spent weekends and summers in Millbrook, and their property was one of the largest in the area, about 40 acres of manicured grounds and a house that looked like something out of Architectural Digest. I responded alone, which was standard procedure for our department. As I drove up the long circular driveway, I could see lights on in the main house, but everything seemed quiet. No signs of disturbance, no evidence of whatever the neighbor had reported. I knocked on the front door and was greeted by Thomas Morrison himself, mid-50s, expensively dressed even at 11 o'clock at night, with the kind of confidence that comes from having more money than most people see in a lifetime. "Officer?" He looked at my nameplate. "Kowalski, what can I do for you?" "We received a report of a disturbance at this address, sir. Screaming and possible gunshots. I need to check and make sure everyone's safe." Morrison's expression didn't change, but I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of calculation, like he was deciding how to handle this situation. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," he said smoothly. "We're having a small dinner party, and my son and his friends were watching an action movie in the theater room. Very loud sound system. I can see how that might have been mistaken for something else." It was a plausible explanation. Rich people had home theaters with sound systems that could rattle windows. But something about Morrison's demeanor bothered me. He was too calm, too prepared with his explanation, like he'd been rehearsing it. "I'll need to come in and verify that everyone's safe," I said, following standard procedure for welfare checks. Morrison's smile tightened slightly. "Of course, though I should mention that we have some prominent guests here tonight, people who value their privacy. I'm sure you understand the importance of discretion in a town like Millbrook." He led me into the house, and I immediately understood what he meant by prominent guests. The living room was full of people I recognized from newspapers and television, politicians, business leaders, even a federal judge whose confirmation hearings had been in the news recently. These weren't just wealthy people. These were powerful people. People whose influence extended far beyond the Hudson Valley. "As you can see," Morrison said, gesturing toward his guests, "everything is perfectly normal. Just a quiet evening among friends." But everything wasn't normal. The guests looked nervous, jumpy, like they'd been interrupted in the middle of something they didn't want discovered. Several of them had their phones out, presumably calling lawyers or assistants or whoever people like that call when police show up unexpectedly. More importantly, I could smell something that didn't belong in a dinner party: the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder. Recent gunshots had definitely been fired somewhere in this house. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need to do a complete sweep of the property to make sure there's no immediate danger to anyone present. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Morrison's smile disappeared entirely, and I could see several of his guests exchanging worried glances. "Officer Kowalski," Morrison said, and his tone had changed from polite to commanding. "I think there may be some confusion about your authority here. Perhaps you should call your supervisor before proceeding." It was phrased as a suggestion, but it felt like a threat. And Morrison was right about one thing. I was way out of my depth. These people had more legal firepower than our entire department could handle, and I was just a rookie cop who didn't know what he was walking into. I excused myself to the front porch and called Chief Harrison. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been expecting my call. "Chief, I'm at the Morrison estate responding to a disturbance call. The resident is claiming it was just a loud movie, but I can smell gunpowder and the guests are acting nervous. I think something happened here." There was a long pause before Harrison responded. "Danny, I need you to listen very carefully. Mr. Morrison is one of the most important people in this town. His family contributes more to our budget than the next 10 taxpayers combined. If he says everything is fine, then everything is fine." "But Chief, I think—" "What you think doesn't matter," Harrison interrupted. "What matters is that you're a probationary officer who needs to learn when to push and when to back off. This is one of those times when you back off." "What about the neighbor who called it in?" "I'll handle the neighbor. You write up a report saying you responded to a noise complaint, found no evidence of criminal activity, and advise the residents to keep the volume down. That's it, nothing more." I stood on that porch for a long time after Harrison hung up, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct I had as a police officer was telling me that something criminal had happened in that house. But my chief, the man who controlled my career, my livelihood, my future in law enforcement, was telling me to walk away. In the end, I did what I was told. I went back inside, told Morrison that everything looked fine, and advised him to keep the noise down out of consideration for his neighbors. He thanked me for my professionalism and discretion, and I left without investigating further. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen and smelled in that house. 2 days later, I checked the local news and found a small item buried in the back pages of the regional paper. New York City businessman Ronald Castellano found dead in Millbrook area. Apparent hunting accident. Ronald Castellano. I recognized the name because I'd seen it on a campaign contribution list during my research for a college political science paper. He was a lobbyist with connections to organized crime families, the kind of person who moved in the shadows between legitimate business and criminal enterprises. And according to the news report, he'd been found dead from a gunshot wound on a hiking trail about 2 miles from the Morrison estate. The story said he'd been alone, that his death appeared to be an accidental discharge of his own hunting rifle, and that no foul play was suspected. But Castellano had been at the Morrison estate that night. I was sure of it. I'd seen him in the living room with the other guests, nervous and sweating and checking his phone like he was expecting bad news. I tried to put it together in my head. Castellano was at the dinner party. Gunshots were fired in the house. Then, Castellano turns up dead from a gunshot wound 2 miles away, and everybody's calling it a hunting accident. That's when I realized I'd witnessed the aftermath of a murder. I should have gone straight to the state police or the FBI. Should have reported what I'd seen and let investigators with more authority and resources handle it. But I was young and stupid and convinced that I could handle it myself. Instead, I started my own investigation. I began by researching the guests I'd seen at the Morrison estate, trying to understand what they might have had in common besides wealth and power. What I found was a network of business relationships, political connections, and financial dealings that stretched from Wall Street to Washington, D.C. Thomas Morrison wasn't just a banker. He was the kind of banker who specialized in moving money for people who needed their financial activities to remain private. Several of his guests were involved in businesses that generated enormous amounts of cash that needed to be cleaned before it could be legitimately invested. Others were politicians who needed campaign funding that couldn't be traced back to its original sources, and Ronald Castellano had been the middleman who connected these legitimate business people with the criminal organizations that generated the dirty money in the first place. It was a money laundering operation that used legitimate businesses in small towns like Millbrook to clean criminal proceeds. The Morrison estate wasn't just a weekend retreat, it was a meeting place where deals were made, percentages were negotiated, and problems were solved. And Ronald Castellano had apparently become a problem that needed solving. But proving any of this would require evidence that I didn't have access to. Financial records, communications, documentation of the relationships between these people. All of it was beyond the reach of a small-town patrol officer. What I could do was keep watching, keep learning, keep building a case piece by piece. That's when Chief Harrison made me an offer that changed everything. It was a Friday afternoon in early May, about a month after the Morrison incident. Harrison called me into his office and closed the door, something he'd never done before. "Danny, you've been with us for 4 months now, and you're doing good work. Real good work. I think it's time we had a conversation about your future with the department." He leaned back in his chair and studied me like he was trying to see inside my head. Small-town policing is different from what they teach you at the academy. It's more personal, more complicated. Sometimes doing the right thing means bending the rules a little bit. Sometimes protecting the community means protecting the people who make the community possible. I didn't say anything, just waited to see where he was going with this. The Morrison family, for example. They employ 37 people in this town. Gardeners, housekeepers, maintenance workers, security staff. Their property taxes pay for about 15% of our town budget. Their charitable contributions fund the library, the youth programs, the senior center. They're not just residents of Millbrook, they're pillars of the community. Harrison stood up and walked to the window overlooking Main Street. Now, sometimes people like the Morrisons find themselves in complicated situations. Business disputes, family problems, political issues. Things that could be handled quietly and discreetly, or things that could become public scandals that destroy not just them, but everyone who depends on them. He turned back to face me. When those situations arise, the Millbrook Police Department has a choice. We can handle things by the book, follow every procedure to the letter, and watch our community get torn apart by negative publicity and legal battles. Or we can use our discretion, our local knowledge, our understanding of the people involved to find solutions that protect everyone's interests. "What kind of solutions?" I asked, though I was starting to understand where this conversation was heading. "The kind that require maturity, discretion, and loyalty to the community you've sworn to serve. The kind that sometimes look irregular to outsiders who don't understand the complexities of small-town life." Harrison opened his desk drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. "The town council has authorized a special community liaison position. Plain clothes work, flexible schedule, direct reporting to me. The pay is double your current salary, plus overtime opportunities that could bring it up to 6 figures annually. Housing allowance, vehicle allowance, full benefits." He slid the envelope across the desk toward me. "The position involves working closely with Millbrook's most prominent residents, helping them navigate situations where their interests and the community's interests align. Sometimes that means providing security for private events. Sometimes it means conducting discreet investigations into business competitors or political opponents. Sometimes it means ensuring that certain information doesn't become public knowledge. I stared at the envelope without touching it. And sometimes it means covering up murders. Harrison's expression didn't change. It means understanding that there are different kinds of justice. Sometimes formal legal processes serve the community's interests. Sometimes they don't. Part of growing up as a police officer is learning to tell the difference. What happened to Ronald Castellano? Ronald Castellano died in a hunting accident. The medical examiner confirmed it. The state police investigated and found no evidence of foul play, and the case is closed. That's what happened to Ronald Castellano. But what really happened? Harrison leaned forward and fixed me with a stare that made my blood run cold. What really happened is that a dangerous criminal who was threatening the safety and security of this community is no longer a threat. What really happened is that a problem got solved in a way that protected innocent people from becoming collateral damage. What really happened is that justice was served, even if it didn't happen in a courtroom. He gestured toward the envelope again. The question now is whether you're mature enough to understand that kind of justice and loyal enough to help protect it. I should have walked out of that office right then. Should have gone straight to the state police, the FBI, internal affairs, anyone with the authority to investigate what Harrison was telling me. Should have refused to be part of a system that treated murder as just another problem to be managed. But I didn't. I opened the envelope. Inside was a job description for the Community Liaison Specialist position, along with a salary offer that was more money than my father had ever made in his best year. There was also a non-disclosure agreement that would legally prevent me from discussing anything I learned in the position, and a loyalty oath that pledged my complete discretion and absolute commitment to protecting the interests of the Millbrook community. And at the bottom of the pile was a photograph. It showed me standing on the Morrison Estate's front porch the night of Castellano's murder, talking on my cell phone to Chief Harrison. But the angle of the photo suggested it had been taken from inside the house, which meant someone had been watching me, documenting my presence at the scene. They had evidence that I'd been there. Evidence that I'd responded to the call, investigated the scene, and then filed a false report claiming nothing had happened. Evidence that could be used to destroy my career and possibly implicate me in a cover-up. Like I said, Harrison continued, small-town policing is more complicated than what they teach at the academy. Sometimes you find yourself in situations where your only choice is between being part of the solution or being part of the problem. I signed the papers. The community liaison position was everything Harrison had promised, and worse than anything I could have imagined. The work was irregular and often conducted at night or on weekends. Sometimes I provided security for private parties where I wasn't supposed to see or hear what was going on. Sometimes I investigated people who were asking too many questions about prominent residents' business activities. Sometimes I delivered messages that weren't supposed to leave paper trails, and sometimes I helped clean up messes that couldn't be allowed to become public scandals. The first mess I helped clean up involved a hit-and-run accident on Route 44, just outside Millbrook's town limits. A prominent local businessman's son had been driving drunk when he struck and killed a cyclist, then fled the scene. By the time state police responded to the accident, the son was safely at home with an alibi provided by a dozen witnesses who swore he'd been at a family dinner all evening. My job was to canvass the area around the accident scene and recover any security camera footage from nearby businesses before state police investigators could request it. The footage that might have shown the son's vehicle leaving the scene disappeared into an evidence storage facility that didn't officially exist. The cyclist's death was ruled an unsolved hit-and-run. The businessman's son continued his life without consequences. The family made a large anonymous donation to a bicycle safety advocacy group, and everyone agreed that justice had been served in its own way. The second mess involved a federal investigation into campaign finance violations by a congressman whose largest donors happened to be prominent Millbrook residents. My job was to monitor the activities of federal investigators who were staying at local hotels, document their movements, and report back on the progress of their investigation. I used my access to local police databases to run background checks on the investigators, identifying personal and financial information that could be used to pressure them if necessary. I also arranged for their hotel rooms to be accidentally double-booked, forcing them to stay farther away and making their investigation more difficult. The investigation was eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence, though I suspect the real reason was that the investigators had been convinced that pursuing the case would be bad for their careers. By the time I'd been in the liaison position for 6 months, I was making more money than I'd ever imagined possible, and living a lifestyle that would have been impossible on a patrol officer's salary. New car, expensive apartment in a converted mansion, designer clothes, regular dinners at restaurants that charged more for a meal than I used to make in a week. But I was also complicit in a system of corruption that went far beyond anything I'd understood when I first signed those papers in Chief Harrison's office. The Millbrook Police Department wasn't just covering up crimes committed by wealthy residents. It was actively participating in criminal enterprises that generated millions of dollars in illegal profits. Money laundering, tax evasion, political corruption, even human trafficking, all of it was being facilitated by a police department that had been completely captured by the criminal interests it was supposed to be fighting. And I was drowning in it. The turning point came in November, 8 months after I'd accepted the liaison position. Harrison called me into his office on a Sunday morning and told me we had a special situation that required immediate attention. A young woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to the dispatcher from my first story, had been asking questions about the death of Ronald Castellano. She was the investigative journalist from New York City who'd been researching connections between organized crime and political corruption in rural areas. Chen had somehow learned about the dinner party at the Morrison estate the night Castellano died, and she'd been interviewing neighbors, checking local records, and asking the kind of questions that could unravel years of carefully constructed cover stories. "She's becoming a problem," Harrison said, handing me a thick file on Chen's activities. "She's talked to the neighbor who called in the noise complaint. She's requested autopsy records on Castellano, and she's scheduled interviews with several of our prominent residents." I flipped through the file, which contained detailed surveillance reports on Chen's movements, copies of her hotel registration and car rental agreements, even transcripts of phone calls she'd made to sources in New York. "What do you want me to do?" "Initially, we want you to make contact with her. Find out exactly what she knows and how she learned it. See if there's a way to convince her that she's wasting her time, that there's no story here worth pursuing." Harrison leaned back in his chair and fixed me with that cold stare I'd learned to recognize. "If she can't be convinced to drop the investigation voluntarily, then we'll need to explore other options for protecting the community's interests." I knew what other options meant. I'd seen what happened to problems that couldn't be solved through negotiation or intimidation. "Chief, I can't. You can and you will." Harrison interrupted. "You signed a loyalty oath to this community, and you've accepted substantial compensation for your services. This is what that loyalty and compensation require." He slid another envelope across the desk. "In addition to your regular salary, you'll receive a $50,000 bonus for successfully resolving this situation. Consider it hazard pay." That night, I met Sarah Chen at a coffee shop in nearby Rhinebeck. She was in her early 30s, obviously intelligent and determined, the kind of journalist who didn't give up easily when she caught the scent of a story. "Officer Kowalski," she said when I introduced myself. "I wasn't expecting to hear from the Millbrook Police Department. Are you here to help with my investigation? Actually, I'm here to suggest that you might be wasting your time. Millbrook is a very quiet town. The kind of story you're looking for probably doesn't exist here." Chen smiled and pulled out a digital recorder. "Do you mind if I record this conversation? I find it helps me remember details accurately." I should have said yes. Should have let her record everything I was about to tell her, so there would be evidence of what the Millbrook Police Department was really doing. But I was too deep into the corruption by then, too afraid of the consequences of stepping out of line. "I'd prefer if you didn't." "Okay." She put the recorder away, but I noticed she kept her notebook open. "Can you tell me about the night Ronald Castellano died? I understand there was a noise complaint at the Morrison estate. There was a report of loud noise from a neighbor. I investigated and found that the residents were watching a movie with the volume turned up. I advised them to be more considerate of their neighbors, and that was the end of it. Did you see Ronald Castellano at the Morrison estate that night?" This was the moment where I should have told her the truth. Should have described exactly what I'd seen and smelled in that house. The nervous guests, the gunpowder residue, the way Morrison had tried to prevent me from investigating. Instead, I lied. "I don't recall seeing anyone matching Mr. Castellano's description at the residence." Chen made a note in her notebook. "According to phone records, Mr. Castellano received several calls from numbers registered to Morrison family businesses in the days before his death. Do you know anything about a business relationship between them?" "I wouldn't know anything about Mr. Morrison's business relationships." "Have you investigated any other incidents involving the Morrison family or their associates?" "The Morrison family are respected members of the community. They rarely require police attention." Chen studied my face for a long moment, and I could see that she didn't believe what I was telling her. She was too experienced as an investigative reporter not to recognize evasion and misdirection. "Officer Kowalski, I've been researching corruption in small-town police departments for several years. I know what it looks like when local law enforcement has been compromised by wealthy residents or criminal organizations. I also know that good cops sometimes get caught up in situations they didn't choose and can't easily escape." She leaned forward and lowered her voice. "If you know something about what happened to Ronald Castellano, if you have information about corruption in the Millbrook Police Department, this is your chance to do the right thing. I can protect your identity, and I can help you get connected with federal investigators who can provide immunity in exchange for cooperation." For a moment, I considered telling her everything. About Harrison's offer, about the liaison position, about all the crimes I'd helped cover up over the past 8 months, about the system of corruption that had turned a small-town police department into a private security force for criminal organizations. But then, I thought about the loyalty oath I'd signed, the non-disclosure agreement that could send me to prison if I violated it, the photographs they had of me at the Morrison estate. I thought about the $50,000 bonus Harrison had offered, and the lifestyle I'd grown accustomed to, and the career I'd destroy if I became a whistleblower. "Miss Chen, I think you're looking for a story that doesn't exist. Millbrook is exactly what it appears to be. A quiet small town where people live peaceful lives and mind their own business. Sometimes a hunting accident is just a hunting accident." Chen closed her notebook and stood up to leave. "Officer Kowalski, I hope you understand that this investigation is going to continue whether you cooperate or not. I have sources, I have documents, and I have enough information to start connecting dots that someone obviously doesn't want connected." She paused at the door and looked back at me. "When this story breaks, and it will break, you're going to have to decide whether you want to be remembered as one of the good cops who got caught up in a bad situation, or as one of the bad cops who chose corruption over justice." After she left, I sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours, trying to decide what to do. I knew Chen was right. She was going to continue her investigation, and eventually she was going to uncover enough evidence to expose the corruption in the Millbrook Police Department. When that happened, everyone involved was going to face federal charges, and the people at the bottom of the conspiracy were going to be the ones who paid the highest price. I also knew that Harrison and his associates weren't going to let Chen's investigation continue indefinitely. If they couldn't discredit her, or intimidate her into backing off, they were going to solve the problem the same way they'd solved the problem with Ronald Castellano. When I got back to Millbrook, I called Harrison and told him that Chen couldn't be convinced to drop her investigation. "I see," he said. "In that case, we'll need to move to Phase 2 of our contingency plan." "What's Phase 2? "Ms. Chen appears to be struggling with depression and substance abuse issues. She's been drinking heavily while staying in the area, and she's been making increasingly erratic statements about conspiracy theories and police corruption. Unfortunately, people in her condition sometimes make poor decisions about their personal safety." The implication was clear. They were going to kill Sarah Chen and make it look like suicide. "Chief, I can't be part of that." "You already are part of it, Danny. You've been part of it since the day you signed that loyalty oath. The only question now is whether you're going to honor your commitments to this community, or whether you're going to become another problem that needs to be solved." That night, I sat in my expensive apartment, surrounded by all the things I'd bought with my corruption money, and tried to figure out how my life had gone so wrong so quickly. 8 months earlier, I'd been an idealistic rookie cop who wanted to make a difference in the world. Now, I was complicit in money laundering, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and potentially murder. But I also knew that if I tried to back out now, if I tried to go to federal authorities or cooperate with Chen's investigation, I would probably end up like Ronald Castellano, another accident that would be investigated by the same corrupt department that had arranged it. The next morning, Harrison called me into his office and laid out the plan for dealing with Sarah Chen. Chen had been staying at a bed and breakfast in Rhinebeck, about 15 minutes from Millbrook. She'd been drinking alone at the bar every night, asking locals about the Morrison family and the Castellano case, making the kind of inquiries that made people uncomfortable. Tonight, she's going to have a few too many drinks and decide to drive back to New York City despite being intoxicated, Harrison explained. Unfortunately, Route 9 can be very dangerous at night, especially for someone who's not familiar with the area and might be impaired. He showed me a map of a stretch of highway that ran along the Hudson River, with several sharp curves and steep drops that would be treacherous for an impaired driver. There's a particular curve at mile marker 47 where vehicles occasionally leave the roadway and end up in the river. Usually, by the time the vehicle is recovered, it's impossible to determine whether the driver was impaired, had a medical emergency, or simply lost control due to road conditions. You want me to kill her? I want you to solve a problem that threatens everything we've built in this community. The method is up to you, but the outcome isn't negotiable. Harrison slid a set of car keys across the desk. Untraceable rental vehicle, paid for with cash, registered under a false identity. You'll make contact with Miss Chen at the bar, suggest that she's had too much to drink to drive safely, and offer to give her a ride back to her hotel. During the drive, you'll take a detour to dispose of the problem. And if I refuse, then you'll become part of the problem, and problems get solved one way or another. I took the keys. That evening, I drove to Rhinebeck in the rental car, a nondescript sedan that wouldn't be memorable to any witnesses. The plan was simple. Wait for Chen to leave the bar, approach her in the parking lot, convince her to accept a ride, then take her to the designated location on Route 9 where her accident would occur. But when I got to the bed and breakfast, Chen wasn't there. The bartender said she'd checked out that morning and driven back to New York City, leaving no forwarding information. I called Harrison immediately. "She's gone, left town this morning." There was a long pause before Harrison responded. "That's unfortunate, but not necessarily a problem. We'll monitor the situation and see what develops. What if she publishes her story?" If she publishes a story based on speculation and anonymous sources, it will be dismissed as conspiracy theory nonsense. If she tries to publish a story based on verifiable evidence, she'll discover that certain evidence has been sealed by court order or destroyed in accordance with records retention policies. And if she has enough evidence to make federal charges stick, then we'll implement the ultimate contingency plan. I didn't ask what the ultimate contingency plan involved. I was pretty sure I didn't want to know. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. No story appeared in any newspaper or magazine. No federal investigators showed up asking questions. Chen seemed to have disappeared as completely as if she'd never existed. I started to think that maybe Harrison had been right. Maybe Chen's investigation had been based on speculation and suspicion rather than solid evidence. Maybe she'd realized that she couldn't prove her theories and had moved on to other stories. Then I saw the news report. Investigative journalist Sarah Chen was found dead in her Manhattan apartment yesterday evening, apparent victim of a drug overdose. Chen, who specialized in reporting on political corruption and organized crime, had been struggling with depression and substance abuse issues according to friends and colleagues. Police found evidence of recent heroin use, and the medical examiner has tentatively ruled the death an accidental overdose pending toxicology results. The report included a brief mention that Chen had been working on a story about rural police corruption at the time of her death, but that her editor said the investigation had been indefinitely postponed due to lack of corroborating evidence. I knew immediately that it wasn't a drug overdose. Chen had been murdered by the same people who'd killed Ronald Castellano, using the same methods they'd planned to use on the Route 9 highway. They'd made it look like an accident. They'd controlled the investigation, and they'd ensured that her story would never be published. And I'd been part of it. Maybe I hadn't injected the heroin into her veins, but I'd helped create the circumstances that led to her death. I'd lied to her when she'd given me a chance to tell the truth. I'd reported her activities to the people who'd ultimately killed her. That night, I sat in my apartment and tried to figure out how to live with what I'd become. I joined the police force to protect people like Sarah Chen, honest citizens trying to expose corruption and hold powerful people accountable. Instead, I'd become one of the people she'd been trying to expose. But I also knew that if I tried to go to federal authorities now, if I tried to confess what I knew about Chen's murder or the Castellano case, I'd end up dead just like both of them. Harrison and his associates had too much money, too much power, too many connections to let a small-town patrol officer destroy everything they'd built. So I kept my mouth shut and continued doing my job, helping to cover up crimes and intimidate witnesses and protect the interests of people who treated murder as just another business expense. For 2 more years. The money was good, better than good. By the time I'd been in the liaison position for 3 years, I was making close to $200,000 annually between my salary, bonuses, and consulting fees from Morrison's various business entities. I owned a house that would have been impossible on a legitimate police officer's salary, drove a car that cost more than most people's annual income, and had a bank account that would have raised red flags if anyone had been paying attention to how much a small-town cop was earning. But the work was getting darker, more violent, more obviously criminal. What had started as covering up minor indiscretions and business disputes had evolved into a full-scale criminal enterprise that used the Millbrook Police Department as its enforcement arm. We weren't just protecting wealthy residents from embarrassing scandals anymore. We were actively participating in their criminal activities. Money laundering through fake consulting contracts with the police department. Evidence tampering in federal investigations. Witness intimidation that sometimes escalated to physical violence. And increasingly, the elimination of people who posed threats to the organization. The breaking point came in March 2022, 3 years after I'd signed that loyalty oath in Chief Harrison's office. A state police detective named Lisa Martinez had been investigating financial irregularities in several rural police departments across the Hudson Valley. She'd noticed patterns in evidence handling, unusual budget allocations, and personnel files that suggested systematic corruption. Her investigation had started in Ulster County, but it was expanding to include departments in Dutchess, Columbia, and Greene counties, including the Millbrook Police Department. Martinez had requested access to our financial records, personnel files, and evidence logs as part of her investigation. She'd also scheduled interviews with several officers, including me. This is a problem that requires a permanent solution, Harrison told me during a meeting at the Morrison estate. Detective Martinez has access to information that could destroy not just this department, but the entire network we've built across the region. By then, I'd learned that the corruption in Millbrook wasn't an isolated incident. Harrison and Morrison were part of a regional network that had compromised police departments in at least 6 counties, creating a law enforcement system that served criminal interests rather than public safety. Money laundering, drug trafficking, human trafficking, political corruption. All of it was being facilitated by police officers who'd been bought, blackmailed, or intimidated into cooperation. And Detective Martinez was getting close to exposing the entire operation. What kind of permanent solution? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The kind that ensures Detective Martinez doesn't continue her investigation or share her findings with federal authorities. Morrison leaned forward in his chair, fixing me with the cold stare I'd learned to associate with violence. Detective Martinez has a teenage daughter who attends boarding school in Connecticut. She also has elderly parents living in a retirement community in Florida. People in her situation need to understand that their family's safety depends on making responsible decisions about their professional activities. You want me to threaten her family? I want you to help her understand the consequences of continuing an investigation that threatens the stability of multiple communities and the livelihoods of hundreds of law-abiding citizens. Harrison pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. Detective Martinez's daily routine, her family's schedules, her personal relationships, her financial situation. Everything you need to have a productive conversation with her about the wisdom of focusing her investigative efforts elsewhere. I opened the folder and found detailed surveillance reports on Martinez and her family. Photos of her daughter at school, her parents at their retirement home, her ex-husband at his job in Albany. Phone records, credit reports, medical records. A complete dossier that could only have been compiled with access to law enforcement databases and government records. How long have you been watching her? Since the day she started asking questions about rural police corruption. We've been monitoring every investigator, journalist, and federal agent who's shown interest in our operations. Most of them can be redirected or discouraged through unofficial channels. Detective Martinez requires a more direct approach. Morrison stood up and walked to the window overlooking his manicured gardens. Officer Kowalski, I want to be very clear about something. Detective Martinez's investigation threatens a business network that generates over $50 million annually and employs hundreds of people across multiple states. The people who benefit from this network include not just police officers like yourself, but politicians, judges, business leaders, and even federal agents who've been helpful in keeping certain investigations from proceeding. He turned back to face me. This isn't just about protecting a few corrupt cops in a small town. This is about protecting an entire ecosystem of mutually beneficial relationships that keep money flowing, problems solved, and communities stable. Detective Martinez is threatening something much larger than herself, and she needs to understand that. And if she doesn't listen to reason, then she'll serve as an example to other law enforcement officers who might be tempted to investigate things that are none of their business. That night, I drove to Detective Martinez's home in Kingston, about 40 minutes from Millbrook. She lived in a modest, suburban neighborhood, the kind of middle-class area where state police detectives could afford to raise families on legitimate salaries. I'd been planning to approach her at her house to have a private conversation about the wisdom of continuing her investigation. But when I got there, I saw something that changed everything. Martinez was in her driveway, loading boxes into her car. Not suitcases or personal items, file boxes, the kind that contain case documents and evidence. She was working alone, moving quickly, looking over her shoulder like she expected someone to be watching her. I parked down the street and observed her activities through binoculars. She loaded about a dozen boxes into her car, then went back into the house and returned with a laptop bag and what looked like external hard drives. She was copying her investigation files and moving them somewhere safe, which meant she suspected that her official investigation was compromised, that someone had leaked information about her activities to the people she was investigating. I called Harrison immediately. She's moving her files, looks like she's copying everything, and taking it somewhere outside official channels. Where's she taking it? I don't know. She's being careful about surveillance, taking a circuitous route. But wherever she's going, she doesn't trust her own department to protect her investigation. There was a long pause before Harrison responded. Follow her. Find out where she's taking the files. Do not approach her directly. We need to know how much she's discovered and who else she might be working with. I followed Martinez through Kingston and onto Route 9W, heading south toward New York City. She drove carefully, staying within speed limits, checking her mirrors frequently. She was definitely aware that she might be under surveillance. The drive took about 2 hours, ending at a storage facility in Yonkers. Martinez rented a unit under what appeared to be a false name, paid cash, and transferred her boxes from the car to the storage unit. She spent about 20 minutes inside the unit, presumably organizing the files and setting up some kind of security system. When she left the storage facility, she drove to a nearby copy center that was open 24 hours. She spent another hour there, apparently making additional copies of key documents. Then she drove to a post office and mailed several packages to addresses I couldn't see from my surveillance position. She was definitely preparing for something. Creating backups, establishing deadman switches, ensuring that her investigation would continue even if something happened to her. Which meant that threatening her family wouldn't be enough to stop her. She'd already moved beyond the point where personal intimidation would be effective. I called Harrison again and reported what I'd observed. She's creating insurance policies, I told him. Multiple copies of her files, backup systems, probably deadman switches that will release information if something happens to her. Threatening her isn't going to work. She's already planned for that possibility. Then we'll need to implement a more comprehensive solution. Meaning what? Meaning Detective Martinez has forced us to treat her as an enemy combatant rather than just an inconvenient investigator. The plan they developed was elaborate and vicious. Martinez would be killed in what appeared to be a home invasion robbery. Her house would be burglarized, her computers stolen, her investigation files destroyed. The crime would be committed by local drug addicts who'd been arrested multiple times by various police departments in the network. People who could be controlled through threats of prosecution or promises of reduced sentences. But the real purpose wasn't just to kill Martinez. It was to send a message to any other law enforcement officers who might be tempted to investigate corruption in rural police departments. The message was simple. If you threaten us, we can reach you anywhere, and we can make your death look like random crime. Your role, Harrison explained, is to ensure that the burglary appears authentic and that all investigative materials are properly disposed of. You'll also monitor the police response to ensure that the investigation doesn't uncover any connections to our network. You want me to help murder a police officer? I want you to help protect a system that has provided you with financial security and professional advancement for 3 years. Detective Martinez has chosen to threaten that system, and she's accepted the consequences of that choice. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying me like he was evaluating my reliability. Officer Kowalski, I think it's time we discuss the long-term structure of our relationship. The work you've been doing for us has been exemplary, and we're prepared to offer you a more permanent position within our organization. He slid a contract across the table. Chief of Police, Millbrook Police Department. Harrison is retiring next year, and we need someone we can trust completely to take over the operation. The position comes with a base salary of $300,000 annually, plus performance bonuses that could double that amount. I stared at the contract without touching it. 3 years earlier, becoming police chief of a small town would have been a dream job, the culmination of everything I'd hoped to achieve in law enforcement. Now it was being offered as a reward for helping to murder a fellow police officer. There are also some personal benefits we'd like to discuss, Morrison continued. A house in one of Millbrook's most exclusive neighborhoods, fully paid for. A trust fund that will ensure your financial security for the rest of your life. And most importantly, protection from any federal investigations that might threaten our operations. What kind of protection? The kind that comes from having allies in the Justice Department, the FBI, and other federal agencies. People who understand that rural law enforcement corruption is a necessary evil that keeps worse problems from developing. Harrison leaned forward. Danny, you need to understand something. We're not just a local criminal organization. We're part of a national network that includes people at the highest levels of government, business, and law enforcement. The kind of people who can make federal investigations disappear, who can ensure that certain evidence never makes it to trial, who can guarantee that cooperative officers never face consequences for their actions. And non-cooperative officers? Non-cooperative officers discover that their medical examiner friends are very creative about explaining unusual deaths. That night, I sat in my house, the house I'd bought with corruption money, and tried to figure out what to do. I had less than 24 hours before Detective Martinez would be murdered by people I'd helped identify and coordinate. After that, I'd either be fully committed to the criminal organization that had consumed my life, or I'd be a loose end that needed to be eliminated. But I also knew that going to federal authorities would probably be pointless. Harrison and Morrison had claimed to have allies in federal agencies, and given their level of sophistication and access to information, that claim was probably true. Any attempt to report their activities would likely be leaked back to them before investigators could act on it, which left me with only one option. I had to save Detective Martinez myself, and I had to do it in a way that wouldn't implicate me in the conspiracy. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to Kingston. Instead of going to Martinez's house, I went to the state police barracks where she worked. I waited in the parking lot until I saw her arrive, then approached her as she was walking toward the building. "Detective Martinez?" "My name is Danny Kowalski, Millbrook Police Department. I need to speak with you urgently about your investigation into rural police corruption." She stopped and studied my face, obviously trying to determine whether I was a threat. "What about my investigation, Officer Kowalski?" "Someone's planning to kill you tonight. Make it look like a home invasion robbery. I have information about who's behind it and why, but we need to talk somewhere private." Martinez's expression didn't change, but I could see her hand moving closer to her service weapon. "Why should I trust you?" "Because I'm part of the corruption you're investigating, and I'm trying to get out before more people get killed." She studied me for another long moment, then nodded toward her car. "We'll talk at a secure location. You follow me, but understand that if this is some kind of setup, you won't live to regret it." Martinez led me to a state police facility about 10 miles away, a building that looked like it was used for training or special operations. She parked in a secured area and led me into a room that was obviously designed for sensitive conversations. No windows, soundproofed walls, equipment that could detect electronic surveillance. "Start talking," she said, setting up a digital recorder. So I told her everything. About Harrison's recruitment offer, about the liaison position, about the crimes I'd helped cover up over the past 3 years, about Ronald Castellanos' murder, about Sarah Chen's assassination, about the network of corruption that extended across multiple counties and reached into federal agencies. I told her about the plan to kill her that night, about the drug addicts who'd been recruited to carry out the murder, about the storage facility where she'd hidden her investigation files, and I told her about the contract Morrison had offered me to become the next chief of police in Millbrook. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked when I'd finished. "Because I've helped kill 2 people, and I can't help kill a third. Because I became a police officer to protect people, and instead, I've become the kind of person that good cops are supposed to stop." Martinez turned off the recorder and leaned back in her chair. "Officer Kowalski, what you've just told me describes one of the most sophisticated corruption networks I've ever encountered. If even half of it is true, we're dealing with a criminal organization that has compromised law enforcement at multiple levels. It's all true, and there's more. Connections to organized crime families, political corruption that reaches into the state capitol, federal agents who've been bought or blackmailed into cooperation. Can you prove any of it?" "I can prove my involvement. I have copies of contracts, payment records, communication logs. I can identify specific crimes and the people who committed them. But the really big fish, Morrison, Harrison, the federal contacts, they're too insulated for direct evidence." Martinez stood up and walked to a secure phone on the wall. "I'm calling the FBI, not through normal channels. Through a contact I trust completely, someone who specializes in law enforcement corruption cases." She made the call, speaking in a code that suggested this wasn't her first experience with compromised communications. When she hung up, she turned back to me. "A federal task force is going to take over this investigation immediately. They'll provide protection for both of us, while they develop the evidence needed to prosecute everyone involved." "What about tonight?" "The plan to kill you. Tonight, Detective Lisa Martinez is going to die in a home invasion robbery, just like they planned. But it won't be me. It'll be a federal agent using my identity. When the killers show up, they'll find themselves walking into a trap. The federal operation that followed was the largest law enforcement corruption investigation in New York State history. Over the course of 6 months, federal agents arrested 87 people on charges ranging from money laundering to murder. The defendants included police officers from 6 different departments, county prosecutors, state legislators, federal employees, and even a federal judge who'd been providing inside information about corruption investigations. Harrison, Morrison, and their associates were convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The criminal network they'd built was dismantled completely, with assets worth over $200 million seized by federal authorities. But the damage to public trust in rural law enforcement took years to repair. Multiple police departments were disbanded and reconstituted under federal supervision. Dozens of criminal cases had to be overturned because evidence had been compromised by corrupt officers. Hundreds of victims of police corruption came forward with stories of crimes that had been covered up or investigations that had been sabotaged. As for me, I spent 8 months in federal protective custody while serving as a witness in the prosecution of my former colleagues. I testified in 17 different trials, providing evidence that helped convict people I'd once considered friends and mentors. When the trials were over, I entered the Federal Witness Protection Program and relocated to a different state. I'm no longer a police officer. That career ended the day I decided to save Detective Martinez's life instead of helping to take it. But I work in law enforcement training now, teaching courses about corruption recognition and prevention. My job is to help new officers understand how good cops can become bad cops, how small compromises can lead to major crimes, how the isolation and pressure of police work can make officers vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations. The lesson I try to teach is simple. Corruption doesn't usually announce itself with dramatic offers to participate in obvious crimes. It starts with small favors, minor rule bending, situations where doing the practical thing conflicts with doing the legal thing. It progresses through a series of compromises that seem reasonable at the time, until you wake up one day and realize you've become the kind of person you joined the police force to fight. The Millbrook Police Department was officially disbanded after the federal investigation. The town now contracts with the state police for law enforcement services, and former Millbrook officers are prohibited from working in law enforcement anywhere in New York State. Chief Harrison died in federal prison in 2023, apparently from a heart attack, though there were rumors that he'd been killed by other inmates who didn't appreciate having a corrupt cop in their midst. Thomas Morrison is serving multiple life sentences in a federal supermax facility. His estate was seized by federal authorities and sold to compensate victims of the corruption network. The mansion where I'd attended those meetings now houses a training center for rural law enforcement officers, teaching the kind of ethical policing practices that might have prevented the corruption in the first place. Detective Lisa Martinez received multiple commendations for her investigation and was promoted to head the state police's Internal Affairs Division. She's now responsible for investigating corruption in law enforcement agencies across New York State, using lessons learned from the Millbrook case to identify and prevent similar networks from developing. Sarah Chen's murder case was reopened as part of the federal investigation. Federal prosecutors were able to prove that she'd been killed by associates of the corruption network, though the people directly responsible for her death were never conclusively identified. Her family received a substantial settlement from the federal forfeiture of Morrison's assets. Ronald Castellanos' death was also reclassified as murder rather than hunting accident. Federal investigators were able to prove that he'd been killed at the Morrison estate, and his body moved to the location where it was found, though the physical evidence had been too thoroughly compromised to identify the specific individuals responsible. Both cases remain technically unsolved, though everyone involved in the federal investigation knows what really happened and who was responsible. As for the families of the victims, the people whose loved ones were killed to protect a criminal enterprise disguised as law enforcement, they received financial compensation from the federal forfeiture proceedings. But money can't bring back the dead, can't undo the trauma of losing someone to police corruption, can't restore faith in institutions that were supposed to protect them. The real cost of police corruption isn't measured in dollars or prison sentences. It's measured in the destruction of trust between law enforcement and the communities we're supposed to serve. When people can't trust that police officers will protect them rather than prey on them. When they can't be sure that reporting crimes will lead to justice rather than retaliation. When they have to wonder whether the person wearing a badge is there to help them or harm them, that's when the entire system of law and order breaks down. The Millbrook case taught me that police corruption is like cancer. It starts small, spreads quickly, and destroys everything it touches. The only way to prevent it is early detection and aggressive treatment. Officers need to understand the warning signs. Departments need systems for reporting and investigating suspicious activity, and communities need oversight mechanisms that can identify problems before they become systemic. But most importantly, individual officers need to understand that they have choices. When supervisors ask them to bend rules or ignore evidence, when wealthy residents offer special compensation for special services, when criminal organizations try to recruit them as allies, they can say no. They can report the approaches to appropriate authorities. They can choose to remain the kind of police officers they intended to become rather than the kind they're being pressured to become. I didn't make those choices when I had the chance. I let myself be recruited into a criminal organization because the money was good and the alternatives seemed dangerous. I convinced myself that minor rule bending was acceptable, that protecting wealthy residents was part of community policing, that looking the other way occasionally was just practical law enforcement. By the time I realized what I'd become, I was already complicit in multiple murders and facing a choice between helping to kill a police officer or accepting that I'd probably be killed myself. I made the right choice eventually, but it was almost too late. 2 people died because I didn't have the courage to do the right thing when it mattered most. A journalist who was trying to expose corruption, and a lobbyist who'd become inconvenient to his criminal associates. Their deaths will be on my conscience for the rest of my life, no matter how many corruption cases I help solve, or how many officers I help train to recognize and resist recruitment by criminal organizations. The badge doesn't make you a good person. The uniform doesn't guarantee that you'll do the right thing. The authority we're given as police officers can be used to protect communities or to prey on them. And the choice between those options is made not in academy classrooms or policy manuals, but in real-world situations where doing the right thing might be expensive, dangerous, or professionally damaging. Every police officer faces that choice multiple times during their career. The officers who consistently choose integrity over convenience, justice over expediency, public service over personal benefit, those are the ones who remain police officers in the truest sense of the term. The ones who make different choices become something else entirely, no matter what their badge says or what authority they wield. I learned that lesson too late to save Sarah Chen or Ronald Castellano. But maybe sharing that lesson can help other officers make better choices when they face similar situations. Maybe it can help prevent the next Millbrook Police Department from becoming a criminal enterprise disguised as law enforcement. Maybe it can help preserve some small piece of the public trust that police corruption destroys. That's what I tell myself anyway when I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about the people who died because I was too weak, too greedy, or too scared to do the job I'd sworn to do. But the story doesn't end with federal convictions and witness protection. 3 years after the trials ended, I got a call that brought everything full circle in the most terrifying way possible. I was living under a new identity in a small town in Oregon, working as a civilian instructor at a police training academy, when my federal handler, "We're fighting a hydra," Rodriguez told me. "Every time we cut off one head, 2 more grow back." The people running these networks are learning from their predecessors' mistakes. The investigation that followed was even more extensive than the original Millbrook case. Federal agents identified corruption networks in rural police departments across 17 states, all using similar methods and connected through overlapping business relationships and political alliances. Some of these networks were more sophisticated than the Millbrook operation had been. They used encrypted communications, cryptocurrency transactions, and international money laundering systems that made their activities much harder to trace. They recruited officers more carefully, using psychological profiling and gradual corruption processes that made detection more difficult. Most importantly, they'd learned to diversify their operations across multiple jurisdictions and agencies, making it almost impossible for any single investigation to expose the full scope of their activities. The trials that followed the nationwide investigation took 3 years to complete and resulted in convictions of over 400 people, including police officers, sheriff's deputies, prosecutors, judges, politicians, and business leaders. It was the largest law enforcement corruption prosecution in U.S. history. But even those convictions didn't end the threat. The people running these networks had anticipated federal prosecution and developed succession plans that allowed their operations to continue, even when key personnel were arrested. I spent 5 more years in witness protection, moving between safe houses and temporary identities while federal investigators worked to dismantle the remaining networks and neutralize the threats against witnesses like me. The psychological toll of that experience was worse than anything I'd endured during my time as a corrupt police officer. The constant fear, the isolation from family and friends, the knowledge that powerful people wanted me dead because I'd chosen to do the right thing, all of it combined to create a level of stress and paranoia that nearly broke me. I developed panic attacks, insomnia, and a form of PTSD that made it difficult to function in normal social situations. Federal psychologists helped me understand that what I was experiencing was normal for witnesses in high-profile corruption cases, but understanding it didn't make it easier to live with. The breaking point came in 2028, when I learned that my elderly father had died while I was in protection. I couldn't attend his funeral, couldn't comfort my family, couldn't even contact them to express my condolences because doing so might have compromised my security and put them in danger. That's when I realized that the criminals had won, even though most of them were in prison. They'd successfully destroyed my life, separated me from everyone I cared about, and turned my decision to do the right thing into a source of perpetual suffering. But it was also when I decided to fight back. I contacted Agent Rodriguez and told her I wanted to come out of protection and return to law enforcement training work, even if it meant accepting the risks that came with a public identity. "Danny, these people are still out there," she warned. "They're still making threats, still targeting witnesses. If you surface now, you'll be vulnerable." "I've been vulnerable for 8 years," I replied. "But hiding hasn't protected me from them, and it hasn't stopped them from threatening other witnesses. Maybe it's time to try a different approach." Rodriguez arranged for me to meet with federal prosecutors and Justice Department officials who were developing new strategies for protecting witnesses in organized crime cases. What they told me was both encouraging and terrifying. The good news was that federal law enforcement had learned a great deal about corruption networks since the original Millbrook case. They'd developed new investigation techniques, better legal tools, and more effective methods of dismantling criminal organizations that had infiltrated police departments. The bad news was that the networks had evolved even faster than law enforcement's ability to counter them. They were using artificial intelligence to identify vulnerable officers, social media manipulation to influence local politics, and sophisticated financial instruments to hide their money laundering activities. We're essentially fighting a technological arms race, one of the prosecutors explained. Every time we develop new capabilities, they develop countermeasures. Every time we close one avenue of corruption, they open two new ones. But there was something else they told me that changed my perspective on everything I'd been through. The testimony I'd provided in the original Millbrook case had been used to develop new training programs for law enforcement officers across the country. Federal agencies were using my story, and the stories of other former corrupt officers who'd become whistleblowers, to help honest cops recognize and resist recruitment by criminal organizations. Your decision to save Detective Martinez's life and testify against the network has probably prevented thousands of officers from becoming corrupt, one of the Justice Department officials said. The training programs based on your experience have been implemented in over 3,000 police departments nationwide. That knowledge gave me the courage to make a decision that would have seemed impossible 8 years earlier. I decided to come out of witness protection and return to public law enforcement training work, using my real name and telling my real story to help other officers avoid the mistakes I'd made. The federal protection didn't end. I still have security measures that I can't discuss, and there are still people out there who would like to see me dead. But I'm no longer hiding from them, no longer allowing their threats to control my life. I currently work as a senior instructor at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers, where I teach courses on corruption recognition, ethical decision-making, and whistleblower protection. My classes are attended by federal agents, state investigators, and local police officers from around the country. The story I tell them is simple. Corruption doesn't announce itself with obvious criminal offers. It starts with small compromises that seem reasonable at the time. It progresses through a series of escalating commitments that make backing out increasingly difficult. And it ends with good people doing terrible things because they've lost sight of why they became police officers in the first place. But I also tell them that it's never too late to make the right choice. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing despite being afraid. That protecting the public sometimes means protecting them from other police officers, even when those officers are your friends, your supervisors, or your partners. Most importantly, I tell them that law enforcement is a sacred trust that can't be bought, sold, or compromised without destroying something essential about the relationship between police and the communities they serve. The Millbrook Police Department no longer exists, but its legacy lives on in the training programs and investigative techniques that federal law enforcement has developed to prevent similar corruption from taking root elsewhere. Chief Harrison died in prison, but his methods are still being used by criminal organizations that recruit police officers in rural communities across the country. Thomas Morrison is serving multiple life sentences, but the money laundering systems he developed are still being used to clean criminal proceeds through legitimate businesses. The battle between corruption and integrity in American law enforcement continues, and it will probably continue for as long as there are people with badges and people with money who want to buy their services. But every officer who chooses integrity over convenience, every department that implements effective oversight systems, every community that holds its police accountable, all of them are part of the solution to a problem that threatens the foundation of law and order in our society. The corruption that destroyed the Millbrook Police Department wasn't unique, wasn't isolated, and wasn't a historical artifact that we can safely ignore. It's an ongoing threat that requires constant vigilance, continuous training, and unwavering commitment to the principles that make law enforcement a profession rather than just a job. That's the message I try to convey in every class I teach, every presentation I give, every conversation I have with law enforcement officers who are facing the same choices I faced in Millbrook. The badge gives you power, but it doesn't give you wisdom. The uniform commands respect, but it doesn't guarantee integrity. The authority we wield as police officers can be used to protect communities or to prey on them. And the difference between those choices defines not just individual careers, but the entire institution of law enforcement. I made the wrong choices for 3 years before I found the courage to make the right one. 2 people died because of my weakness, my greed, and my fear of doing what I knew was right. But maybe their deaths won't be completely meaningless if sharing their story helps other officers make better choices when they face similar situations. Maybe it will help preserve some small piece of the public trust that police corruption destroys one compromised officer at a time. That's what I tell myself when I wake up thinking about Sarah Chen and Ronald Castellano anyway. And sometimes on good days, I almost believe it.